Have you ever wondered how Luffy's life would have turned out if he was actually raised by someone else?
Luffy was inspired by Shanks to become a great pirate, but what if that wasn't the only thing that he learned from Shanks, because as we all know, Shanks is a legendary swordsman. Or even better, what if Luffy had a completely different mentor than Shanks to begin with, which leaves us with one of the maybe most fascinating questions in all of One Piece. What would have happened if instead of eating a devil fruit, Luffy had been trained to become a powerful swordsman instead? And let's kick this off where any good pirate story begins, back in a bar. And it is here, of course, that hungry child Luffy is about to eat this devil fruit. But to really set up our what if scenario, this time around, Shanks actually snatches the devil fruit away from Luffy in time. And Luffy is of course furious and demands to have the fruit back, but Shanks and Lucky Roux here finally explain what a devil fruit is and why Luffy can't have it. However, this isn't good enough for Luffy because, come on, what kid wouldn't want to eat a strange purple fruit that gives you crazy powers? So he tries to steal the devil fruit anyways multiple times. And so to finally stop Luffy, Shanks makes a deal with him. If Luffy doesn't try to eat the fruit, Shanks instead will teach him how to use a sword. And oh boy, here we go. This is about to get absolutely insane because of course Luffy immediately agrees and they get right into training. And honestly, Luffy is really going to need it because at this point he's probably more likely to cut off his own foot than to hit an actual opponent. But of course, as we know, Shanks wouldn't actually give him a real sword yet, so he'll have a wooden practice sword for now and maybe a small dagger or something. And that means that for the next couple of months and years, Luffy will be training with a sword, and each time that Shanks comes back to the island, Luffy's going to be super excited to show off his new moves. And just to make this absolutely clear, Luffy here still wants to very much become Pirate King. That part hasn't changed at all, and Shanks still gives him the straw hat, but since he's now training to be a swordsman, he will also want to someday surpass Shanks. Now, of course, Shanks would think that that is absolutely hilarious and will probably tell Luffy that he would have to become the strongest swordsman in the world or something like that. Which, yeah, now means that in addition to Luffy's secret dream and his desire to become Pirate King, we have to add the world's strongest swordsman to his list of dreams as well. However, sword training on his own can't last forever, and eventually Luffy will probably beg Shanks to take him along with him. Now, of course, Shanks will most likely still think that he's not ready, but he would probably agree that Luffy needs someone else to practice with. So in our next massive change to Luffy's story, the Red Hair Pirates take Luffy to find a new master. And now you might be thinking that Luffy's about to go off on some grand adventure, but he's not quite ready for that yet, and so instead Shanks just drops Luffy off at this nearby dojo. And let me tell you, things are about to get super interesting because this is of course the Isshin dojo where Zoro trained during his childhood as well. So yeah, that's right, Luffy and Zoro will meet way earlier in the story, and I can just imagine young Luffy and Zoro instantly becoming fierce rivals, and if we're being honest, probably good friends along the way as well, since both of them will be getting beat up by the daughter of the dojo master, Kuina. However, each of their desires to become the world's strongest swordsman, or swordswoman I guess, is going to lead to a ton of really intense training and a lot of really fierce duels. And now, there's really no telling how long this period in Luffy's life would possibly last, but let's just say that after a year or so, something happens that is going to completely change Luffy's life forever. Because as we know, when Shanks first returned to the Grand Line, he told people about this one kid in the East Blue who reminds him a lot of the former Pirate King. And even more so now, because Luffy is actually also using a sword just like Roger did. And this bit of news has now caught the interest of one man in particular. And so one day at the dojo, during another round of Zoro and Luffy beating up each other, a small ship sails up to the village. And out of that ship walks a man with a large black blade on his back, who is of course none other than the current strongest swordsman in the world, Dracul Mihawk. Get ready for this. Okay, so of course the boys will want to immediately charge in and challenge Mihawk, but Kuina would very wisely hold them down while the Warlord talks to the dojo master Koshiro. But as you well know, you simply can't hold Luffy back, so let's say that he escapes and charges Mihawk with a katana from the dojo. Now, this could very well be the end of Swordsman Luffy, but let's be forgiving here and not imagine that Mihawk whips out his tiny little neck dagger and allows Luffy to test himself a little bit. But yeah, come on, I mean, there's absolutely no way that Luffy's gonna do anything against this man, and eventually Mihawk just sends him flying across the village. However, this is Luffy that we're talking about, so of course he would just get up and come charging right back at Mihawk. And while the swordsman does praise his determination, he then smacks Luffy again, knocks him out, and then decides that he has seen enough. Before he heads back to the ship though, I could imagine him sharing drinks with Koshiro, who has always seemed like a quite respectable swordsman himself. And while the kids, including Zoro, Luffy, and Kuina, are obviously excluded here, that doesn't stop them from sneaking a peek at Mihawk's legendary sword Yoru. Eventually though, time is up and Mihawk does decide to leave. Zoro is still itching to challenge Mihawk himself, but Kuina keeps a firm hold on him to keep him from making the very same mistake as Luffy. So I guess that could have been really bad, but the kids immediately jump back into training after being very much energized by this surprise visitor. There's only one problem though. Luffy is nowhere to be seen. So where is he, you ask? Did he get knocked into the forest and get lost? Is he crying at his failure to beat Mihawk? No, of course not. Come on. This is Luffy we're talking about, and it turns out that after Mihawk has sailed quite far from the island and from the East Blue, he turns around and finds Luffy being dragged along by a rope that he had tied to Mihawk's ship. You know, kind of similar to this guy right here. Now, when Luffy finally manages to climb up onto the ship, he expects Mihawk to be very annoyed, but of course, with Mihawk's observation haki, he already knew that Luffy was there all along. And so when Mihawk finally asks what Luffy actually wants, the young swordsman demands that Mihawk would train him so that he can one day surpass him. And honestly, at this point, it's very possible that Mihawk would just throw Luffy off of the ship, but let's imagine that with Luffy's determination plus what Mihawk already knows about him from Shanks, he tells Luffy that if he can hang on to the outside of the ship all the way through Reverse Mountain, then he will actually train the boy. Now, Luffy will of course obviously be very excited about this, but this is a way harder challenge than it may seem. Because remember, Luffy and the crew were nearly thrown off their own ship when they went through Reverse Mountain, so how will he be doing that hanging off the side of the ship? Of course, at this point, he doesn't have his devil fruit, so he doesn't have to worry about losing his strength in the water, but in the end, after fighting off some very hungry fish, Luffy overcomes the challenge, and together, the world's strongest swordsman and child Luffy head off towards Mihawk's dark, spooky, and kind of emo castle. And now, of course, Luffy is insanely excited. I mean, what up-and-coming swordsman wouldn't want to be trained by the legendary Mihawk? However, there's some serious danger here as well that we simply can't overlook. Because remember that when Zoro landed on Mihawk's island, the world's strongest swordsman made him fight these quite savage sword-wielding mandrills as the first part of his training. And I mean, if Zoro had some trouble with these apes during the time skip, then child Luffy is surely going to be in very serious trouble here. So let's imagine that Mihawk gives Luffy some sort of training first before then making him fight the island beasts as well. And on top of that though, Luffy is also going to have to learn how to take care of himself as well, because Mihawk won't always be at the castle as we well know. For example, he'd also need to learn how to cook and take care of himself, so basically he'd be leveling up in all sorts of ways. And so let's say that after a few years on the island, Luffy has now improved his swordsmanship to a just absurd degree and has even started to learn the basics of armament and observation haki, which at this young age is just a stupidly massive advantage that we'll talk about more in just a moment. But first though, Mihawk finally decides to take him out to fight an actual pirate, but something is going to happen next next that is going to absolutely ruin Luffy's training. Because next they run into this random group of pirates, and as Mihawk takes down the captain, he tells Luffy to wipe out the rest of the crew. And Luffy of course does, quite easily, let's be honest, after all that insane training. But there is one major problem here, because when Mihawk comes back, he finds that Luffy has taken out all the underlings, but he has refused to cut even a single one of them. In other words, yeah, it does seem like Swordsman Luffy, just like regular Luffy, just can't bring himself to actually kill someone. So he basically beat them down with the dull side of the sword, which I would imagine would probably be quite problematic for Mihawk, who has no trouble cutting down opponents, as we know. So he demands that Luffy actually finish the job. But Luffy, being the good person that we know him to be, just can't. So Mihawk finishes the job himself, and they return to the castle at a major crossroads in the story. Here, Mihawk gives Luffy a choice: decide to use his sword to its fullest and continue his training, or leave the island for good. And this is honestly gonna be kind of heartbreaking, since Mihawk has trained Luffy more than anyone ever did, but Luffy just can't bring himself to do it for now. I mean, he's beating opponents, yeah, but he doesn't want to kill them when they're already down, so he makes the sad choice to actually leave. I will say props to him though for sticking to his gut here. And so from here on out, there are actually a few really interesting options that would make sense for what might happen next. For one, I don't think that Mihawk would just completely abandon and throw out Luffy, so maybe he'd give him to someone else that he knows that has a good reputation. For example, someone like Whitebeard, who is well known for taking orphans into his crew. He could also try to take him back to Shanks, but honestly, I think the most reasonable option would be for Luffy to actually return to his hometown. In other words, we're going back to the East Blue and the Goa Kingdom. And if you're a little bit disappointed here, wait a second, because this is actually the best time for Luffy to come back. Because while he doesn't exactly have a home here at this point, Luffy should be perfectly capable of taking care of himself in the forest and even befriending these two ruffians as well. And while this is admittedly a little bit later in the timeline for the boys to meet, I'm still sure that they would still get along just like normal and very quickly become great friends. In fact, the only reason Ace and Sabo were originally hesitant to take in Luffy was because he was young and weak, but this time there is no doubt that Luffy is way stronger than these two older boys. So yeah, remember that scorecard where Luffy had 0 wins? I'm pretty sure that's gonna be very, very different this time around. And so now let's skip forward a little bit. Sabo still decides to leave and gets blown up apparently, and here is where we get our next major change to Luffy's story, because when Ace finally decides to leave as well, there is no way in the world that Swordsman Luffy is staying behind, even though he is only 14 years old at this point. Because even though he still wants to become Pirate King, he is also determined to become the world's strongest swordsman, overcoming Mihawk, and he certainly can't do that just sitting around on an island. And so since he is already so powerful, Swordsman Luffy is coming along for the ride as well, and I think he's strong enough that Ace will let him. And if you actually read the Ace novels about Ace's story, you will know what will happen next. The short of it all is that they get shipwrecked, Ace eats his powerful devil fruit, and then they journey through Sabaody, Fishman Island, and eventually reach Wano. And then in the novels, after leaving Wano, Ace then travels around looking to take down some Yonko, but let's back up here for a second. Because while we are in the land of the samurai, Swordsman Luffy is gonna hop off the train. At this point, Luffy's about 15 years old, and he is just absolutely in love with the idea of training with some actual samurai. So even though it's hard for him to leave behind Ace and the Spade Pirates, Swordsman Luffy can't resist the chance to improve his skills here. The only problem is that Wano is currently ruled by Kaido, and most of the real samurai have either been killed or locked up. So let's say that Luffy travels around for a bit. Maybe he even picks up a ranked sword or two, since this is Wano, and I'm sure they do have a few of those lying around here and there. And I can even see him making some real friends in the Lawless Lands and the leftover town here outside of the capital. But at this point, things will go very, very bad for him. Because let's be real for a second, I just cannot imagine Luffy sitting back and letting his friends in the leftover town starve to death. So maybe he does something really rash, like attacking a food shipment or something, and then he steals food for the town. And this is of course gonna get him into major trouble in Wano, because we all know what happened when Luffy did exactly that in the original story. So yeah, that's not going to end very well, because as strong as Luffy is with his sword skills, his haki, which should be pretty good after a year of traveling with Ace and into the new world, he is still only 15 years old at this point and way weaker than an actual Yonko. Which means that when he comes face to face with the Emperor, he's gonna get pretty badly slapped by Kaido. However, I still believe that this brief fight would still be the perfect time for Luffy to awaken his actual Conqueror's haki. And even though at this point it wouldn't really do anything against Kaido, it might impress the King of the Beasts enough to throw Luffy in prison instead of, you know, straight up killing him. But you won't believe what's gonna happen next, because who else do we know in the same prison as Luffy? Well, there is of course this old man known as Grandpa Hyo. And who is this man? Well, you know, just the most famous Yakuza boss in all of Wano country, who also happens to know the secrets of advanced armament haki. And so after befriending this, at this point not quite as old man, and learning his secrets, Luffy goes through his own little training arc here. And now you might be fairly enough saying that this might be a little bit too early for Luffy to learn about advanced haki, and you might be right, but remember that he has trained with basic haki for at least 5 years at this point, and traveled the seas for a year with Ace. And so I would argue that he has more than enough experience to learn advanced haki at this point as well. I mean, it is still Luffy we're talking about here. And so after a couple of months of training with his new skills, Luffy frees himself, beats up the warden, and of course, as Luffy does, lead a prison break. And this makes Luffy a hero for the escaped prisoners, and they gladly offer to teach Luffy their legendary swordsmanship in the outskirts of Wano. Which is of course exactly what Luffy wanted. However, Luffy's journey in Wano is going to end with a massive tragedy, because Kaido won't just let a full-on prison break go unpunished, so I could see him sending someone like the All-Star Jack or someone to recapture all the prisoners. And while Luffy would definitely put up a really good fight at this point, Jack's thick mammoth skin isn't damaged much by Luffy's dull blade attacks. Remember, he still doesn't want to cut anyone at this point, which means that no one can actually defeat Jack, and in the end, Grandpa Hyo and the other prisoners sacrifice themselves to allow Luffy to escape. Which of course absolutely breaks Luffy's heart, similar to Marineford in the original story. So seriously, this would be the first major setback in his life ever, but now Luffy finally understands what Mihawk was trying to teach him as a kid. Being a swordsman is about knowing when to cut and when not to cut, and Luffy will never truly be a true swordsmaster if he never chooses to cut anything ever. And so at this point, Luffy decides that he will continue his journey and allow himself to cut down anyone who tries to hurt his friends. Tragically enough, it is a really painful lesson here, but similar to Ace's death, one that was important for Luffy to learn. And so what now? I mean, Luffy is already at the end part of the Grand Line, but he isn't anywhere close to reaching the top level of fighters in the world yet. And so honestly, I think he chooses to finally start his own pirate journey and conquer the Grand Line like he always was meant to do. In other words, he's gonna steal a ship and then travels all the way backwards to Reverse Mountain. Now this of course would take him a while, especially on his own, so now he's 17 years old and basically starting his journey at roughly the same time as in the original story. And at this point, there is one major question that we simply must address, because you might be wondering, what about all the other Straw Hats? Because if Luffy's now skipping the East Blue altogether, then will he ever have Zoro, Nami, Usopp, and Sanji join the crew in the first place? Well, the easy answer with Zoro is no. I mean, I don't think that Zoro would ever want to join Luffy's crew if he sees him as a direct rival for the world's strongest swordsman title, but don't worry, we will see more of Zoro in just a moment. As for the others though, well, it might surprise you, but he's actually gonna go and run into Nami very soon because remember, her goal early on in the story was to steal a map of the Grand Line, so let's assume that she also made her way to the Grand Line as well to steal some more treasure. And let's conveniently assume that she also runs into Luffy here, and after seeing how strong Luffy is, she does agree to tag along with him as well. But there is one condition, and that is that Luffy must go back to the East Blue with her and defeat Arlong to free her village. Which honestly, at this point, would pretty much be no problem at all for a swordsman Luffy. I mean, sure, he doesn't have his devil fruit, but he already knows advanced armament and basic observation haki and has awakened his Conqueror's haki, so without a doubt, Luffy would completely wipe the floor with Arlong's whole crew with entire ease. Which means that Nami is 100% ready to follow Luffy anywhere. Now, the real question is, what about the rest of the crew? And I think here I might make a lot of you really angry because I do believe that at this point, Luffy is much less interested in traveling around the East Blue. Instead, he is desperate to go straight back to the Grand Line and find some really strong opponents to fight instead, which means that he's going to miss out on Usopp and Sanji as well. I do think, however, that it would be very fitting for him to run into Zoro though. At this point, Zoro has become a famous bounty hunter, but he is simply no match for Luffy at all. Which just means that Zoro will swear to train way harder and fight Luffy again in the future. Which does mean that we're all packed up and ready to go. Luffy and Nami, the two of them, head off to the Grand Line where their first goal is to find some truly strong opponents to fight. And of course, the closest big bad around is the Warlord Crocodile, who is in the process of conquering Alabasta. Now, Luffy may not have the same connection to the Alabasta Princess Vivi as in the original story, but I'm sure that he would still want to fight Crocodile nonetheless. And hey, I mean, this time around, Luffy wouldn't even need to figure out that sand is weak to water, since Luffy already knows high levels of haki, which means that this fight ends very quickly with Luffy slashing the Warlord to sandy bits in their first encounter. Which now brings us to our next major development for Swordsman Luffy in the story. Because with Crocodile defeated, we now must ask the question, what happens to Nico Robin? Well, clearly she would want to tag along with Luffy since Luffy has shown himself to be quite powerful, but would Luffy even let her join the crew? And honestly, I do think, yeah, I mean, even though at this point Luffy doesn't know Robin's importance of finding the One Piece, he would probably still trust his gut instinct and let her join the crew. He still has the voice of all things and still knows what people's true intentions are. So yeah, it's just Luffy and two women now sailing around the seas, which, I mean, hey, Swordsman Luffy is just a different type of guy, and I guess One Piece has turned into a harem manga at this point. And actually, now that we have two crewmates, it is time for a proper ship. And since Luffy has already traveled through the Grand Line with Ace, he would probably already know about the shipbuilding island Water 7. And so the three of them would head there to buy a real ship. Now, one thing to keep in mind though is that on this island there are government secret agents who are gonna kidnap Robin. And it's very much likely that in this chain of events that would still very much occur, but this time around things are going to turn out way differently. Because originally when Luffy fought these guys, he got absolutely crushed, but now things are a little bit different, you know? However, before anyone can start swinging a sword, I do believe that the CP9 agents would have an invitation for Luffy. You see, since Luffy defeated Crocodile, there is an opening in the Warlords, and the world government would probably see Luffy as a quite interesting candidate to replace Crocodile. The only condition is that Luffy has to give up Robin, and then he can join, which honestly, Swordsman Luffy might consider the offer for a second. I mean, just think about it. He could reunite with Mihawk, who is also a warlord, and fight tons of pirates without ever having to worry about the government. But in the end, he is still Luffy, and he still would reject the offer and instead wipe out all of the government agents all by himself with absolute ease. Oh yeah, I am saying that Luffy at this point solos all of CP9, and if you're somehow upset about that, get over it, because Swordsman Luffy is just on a whole different level in our story here. And so with their new ship ready to go, you could say that Luffy also picks up a ship right here, but honestly, I kind of like the idea of Luffy, Nami, and Robin just going about it on their own. As you know, Mihawk certainly sails on his own, so Luffy might be inspired by his former mentor. So let's skip ahead now to Sabaody, where Swordsman Luffy would meet the right hand of the former pirate king, Silver's Raylegh. And of course, Raylegh has heard about Luffy from Shanks as well, so while I don't think we'd have the same auction house incident, eventually Raylegh would just bust himself out and run into Luffy, which of course would lead to their usual chat where Raylegh agrees to coat Luffy's ship so that he can go into the New Worlds. And so while we avoid the entire Admiral and separation incident this time around, there is one major obstacle before Luffy can actually head back to the New Worlds, which is of course news about Ace's planned execution, which Luffy would absolutely in this scenario also want to stop. And actually, I don't think that Luffy would be able to sneak into the underwater prison, which means that they are headed off straight to Marineford. And oh boy, this is going to be a major showcase for Swordsman Luffy's powers, because remember, this will be his first time seeing his old mentor in many years. On top of that, he hasn't seen Ace since before the Fiery Pirate joined the Whitebeard Pirates as well. In other words, a lot has happened over the last few years for Luffy, and of course I do think that we can say that Luffy will very much impress Whitebeard once again. It's very possible he would even clash with Mihawk for a second, and while he certainly isn't on his mentor's level quite yet, Luffy is going to put up a real fight with his advanced haki, Conqueror's haki, and extremely polished sword skills. In the end though, there is still one fatal flaw to Swordsman Luffy, and that's because Luffy is now more of an individual, and while he has Nami and Robin on his crew, he is missing all of the escaped prisoners from Impel Down who originally helped him in this fight. And without all of that support to take out some of the Marines, I just don't think that Luffy is strong enough on his own at this point to fight through all the admirals and reach his brother, so really sorry Ace fans, he once again is going to die here, which is a pattern throughout most of these what-if scenarios. But that's of course not the end of Swordman Luffy's story though, because even though he's of course devastated by his longtime friend's death, I can still imagine Robin helping Luffy escape, and together they get away just in time, which is going to send Luffy into a truly destructive rage, but this time Nami and Robin are there for him. And of course Luffy will come out of this knowing that he needs to grow stronger, so it still makes a lot of sense to have a 2-year time skip spent training with Raylegh. Who knows, maybe Luffy even upgrades his weapon, and since Luffy is further along with his haki skills, they can now spend their time perfecting his advanced haki and improving his sword techniques as well. Remember, Raylegh is also a swordsman. And so after 2 years, watch out, because this swordsman Luffy is gonna be on a mission. There is absolutely no one who's gonna be able to even come close to stopping him in the early arcs post time skip. He's gonna sweep straight through this evil fishman, this corrupt scientist, and yeah, even through this stringy warlord. And although I do think that he would be challenged by his longtime rival Zoro along the way, who surprisingly has made up his own crew, including Usopp, Sanji, Chopper, and Frankie. However, after learning about the road poneglyphs on Zou, Luffy can then focus solely on collecting the poneglyphs and finding the One Piece, because he doesn't need to rescue Sanji from Big Mom. That's gonna be now Zoro's problem, which is gonna take him straight to Wano to confront one of the only people to ever actually defeat him, the Emperor Kaido. And honestly, I'm sure that Luffy at this point would want to go straight up and challenge the King of the Beasts one-on-one, and honestly, that might not be the worst idea, because remember, Luffy's now a truly overpowered swordsman god, and we do know that Kaido has some PTSD about legendary swordsmen, so there is a very good chance that he could take down Kaido. On the other hand though, Luffy Luffy's overconfidence here could also see him get smacked down by the strongest creature in the world, because remember that Luffy could only truly damage Kaido once he unlocked his major next power-up. And so let's imagine that Luffy has gotten himself into a truly desperate situation. Yeah, he is doing real damage to Kaido, but he can't finish him off. But then Kaido takes it to the next level and is about to crush Luffy with his massive club. And with no other strong crewmates to save him, Luffy is in real trouble until a certain green-haired swordsman swoops in and blocks Kaido's attack. You see, Zoro can't stand seeing his rival taken down by someone else other than him, so he does battle with Kaido as well, which gives Luffy some time to recover. And of course, during this time, he has also figured out the secrets of advanced Conqueror's Haki. And then, once again together, Luffy and Zoro fulfill Wano's dream of finally freeing the country from the legendary dragon tyrants. Which also means that Luffy has earned his second road poneglyph and is truly on the path now to becoming Pirate King and the world's strongest swordsman. However, there are of course still many tough challenges ahead, including confronting his two old mentors, Mihawk and Shanks. And you can just bet that these two will have some of the strongest haki in the entire series, so Luffy's going to need a major power-up in that department before he can even dream of taking any of them down. On a dark night 12 years ago, somewhere in the East Blue, a young kid is trapped in a cage on a ship that is sailing away from his home island. He's shouting and swinging his fist at anyone in reach, but the crew is too strong to care. Then, a figure in a long green cloak walks up, kneels in front of the child, and pulls back his hood. The furious child launches a punch, but the man with the mysterious tattoo easily blocks it and pulls the child tight against the bars. "Where are you taking me?" the child screams. And all the mysterious man says is, "To your new home." The child is Monkey D. Luffy, and the man, he is the most wanted man in the world and the child's father, Monkey D. Dragon. Which of course means that even though Luffy would probably still fight and scream the entire voyage, in this what-if scenario there is literally nothing he can do to stop his father from taking him to the Revolutionary Army headquarters to raise him as a revolutionary. And wow, I mean, this is absolutely going to be completely changing Luffy's life in basically every way imaginable. Some of which are really bad, as we'll see, and surprisingly some of them are incredibly awesome. First of all, let's be real, Luffy wouldn't care even one bit that Dragon is actually his father. I mean, when he originally learned about his father, he didn't care at all either, and I do think that the same would be applying here. But once they get back to the Revolutionary Army's base, I do think that Luffy's attitude will eventually start changing a bit. Because at this point, Dragon's group of freedom fighters is full of people that Luffy became friends with later on anyways, like this huge cyborg guy who saved Luffy at the end of Sabaody. Plus of course Ivankov here, who literally saved Luffy's life during the prison break before the war at Marineford. So knowing Luffy, he will probably start to make friends and be happy here pretty quickly, because if you remember from his original flashback, Luffy truly just wanted to have some friends to hang out with all along. So maybe coming to his father's base might actually have been a good thing. I mean, he'll definitely find some way better mentors than the band of mountain bandits here. But that's of course only the start of things, because you will not believe how much stronger Revolutionary Army Luffy is actually going to become. First of all, we all can assume that Dragon does know Haki, of course, so he'll definitely teach Luffy the basics as he grows up quite a lot earlier. So basically, we can add armament and observation Haki to young Luffy's arsenal. Plus, there are also other characters with devil fruits at the Revolutionaries base, so they might be able to help Luffy master his powers a lot faster, since he didn't really know anyone else with a devil fruit back on his home islands. And on top of that, there are also other fighting styles that Luffy could learn here. For example, this revolutionary fishman is a master of the so-called fishman karate, which is used by the fishmen to control water, but is also an extremely strong martial arts form in general. There's also Ivankov's newcomer Kimpo, which Sanji mastered during the time skip, so really this version of Luffy is going to have way more training and fighting techniques than he did in the original story. But don't worry, things are about to get even more crazy, because when Luffy was 8 years old, there was another super important child that Dragon actually rescued and brought to the revolutionary base. And of course, I am talking about Sabo here, who originally grew up with Luffy and Ace in the forests of his home island. However, once he learned just how awful the rulers of the kingdom were, including his parents, he decided to flee the kingdom to start a life at sea as a pirate. Unfortunately for him, he was basically immediately sunk by a world noble ship and was rescued by Dragon here and then raised as a revolutionary. So add an ally to the party here, because Luffy is now going to have a new best friend from his own home islands. And I mean, you can just imagine the fun and trouble, let's be real, that these two would get into running around the revolutionary army base. They might even destroy the entire thing if we're being honest, but not only that, they'd also have a super important role to play in each other's lives going forward. You see, after Sabo was blown up, he had lost all his memories and completely forgotten his life at the Goa Kingdom. However, that's all going to change here, because I can just imagine when Luffy mentions that he was from the Goa Kingdom, that Sabo most likely would regain those memories that he had lost at this point. And although that wouldn't include his time growing up with Luffy, because remember, that didn't happen in this scenario, Sabo would very much remember Ace, which is going to play a major role, as you can imagine, in just a minute. In fact, once he does regain his memories, Sabo might desperately want to go back to the Goa Kingdom, or at least send a message to let Ace know that he is in fact still alive. And they might even try to convince Ace to even join the revolutionaries, but for now we're going to leave Ace to follow his regular path to becoming a pirate and then joining Whitebeard. Now, at this point, you might be wondering why Dragon wanted to bring Luffy here in the first place, and while there could of course be many reasons, including him just trying to be a decent father for once, the one that makes the most sense, sadly to me, is that Dragon might actually know the true secrets of Luffy's Devil Fruit awakening, so when he learns that his son has eaten those powers, then he will want to raise Luffy himself to give him the best opportunity to one day awaken Gear 5, which is actually the perfect power when you think about it for a revolutionary freedom army. But for now, back to child Luffy here. Perhaps the most game-changing thing about Luffy growing up with Dragon is that there is no way that his father can keep them on the island forever. And so eventually Sabo and Luffy would be taken out on missions all over the world at a probably fairly young age. And during this time, both of these boys and this revolutionary girl will learn so much about the world. Because if we're being honest, originally Luffy had literally zero formal education and knew nothing about the world, but now he would very likely learn about different kingdoms, the races of the world, and probably even really practical stuff like how to actually sail a ship, which we do all know that he never learned that skill in the current storyline. And on top of all that, they would learn about the world government's oppression and dark secrets, along with the revolutionary army's true goals of taking down the world nobles. Now, you might be thinking at this point that Luffy wouldn't really care about all that stuff, and normally I'd say you'd be right, but I think that this version of Luffy in particular would be exposed to so many suffering people very early on in his life that he would also develop a really strong belief that the world nobles are truly evil. And all of this would basically lead to a slightly more mature version of Luffy, I think, although I do have to admit that I can't imagine Luffy ever being the type of person that you would want to take on a secret spy mission with you. I mean, he's not exactly the sneaky type, if you know what I mean, but eventually Luffy, Sabo, and Koala here would probably be given their very own missions to recruit new members or even free oppressed kingdoms. However, Luffy, even as a revolutionary, is still going to have one massive problem. You see, in this scenario, Luffy still has his Devil Fruit and he was still inspired by Shanks. And of course, he still received his Straw Hat. So deep down, he still is dreaming of becoming a pirate. And so let's say that around the age of 17, similar to in the original story, Luffy just one day decides that it's actually time now to follow that inner dream of his. Now, to be fair, Dragon might be absolutely furious about that and even want to try and stop Luffy since he now knows all of the Revolutionary Army secrets, but eventually I think even Dragon would let him go. I mean, he already basically approved of Luffy being a pirate in the current storyline, and besides Dragon, Sabo would probably be the most heartbroken because even though Luffy would probably try to recruit Sabo and Koala to join him on his journey, those two would probably stick around with the revolutionaries for now. But of course, Luffy simply can't set sail on his own, at least not straight straight from the Grand Line. So let's say that the revolutionaries drop him off back in the East Blue and he starts his journey pretty much like in the normal story. And so while his adventure initially is going to start out exactly the same, you're going to be shocked at how quickly Revolutionary Luffy's pirate adventure is going to end. But first, I still think that he recruits his crewmates like normal, so hop on board. Everyone, with the only main difference in the East Blue being that Luffy is way stronger since he now basically already is pretty decent at hockey. So he would fly through his enemies here, freeing the villages from the bad guys, and his father would probably be pretty proud here. And even this man here who gave Luffy his first real defeat would simply be no match for this hockey and karate buffed version of Luffy, which means that most of the pre-time skip arcs will continue like normal, although there are a few super important changes that would just make too much sense with this more mature and politically aware Luffy. For example, in Alabasta, Luffy might just call up Sabo and let him know what is going on with the Civil War. And if the revolutionaries knew about this, they might even come and help stop the people from destroying each other alongside Luffy and the crew. Which, of course, would also be the perfect opportunity for Sabo to reunite with Ace, since Ace, as we know, was also briefly present here. And that, of course, means that Luffy gets to meet the fiery brother that he never had in this version, which is going to play a really big role in the story later on. Now, besides that though, there's really not a whole lot that would change during the pre-time skip arcs. That is, of course, until we reach the government island of Enies Lobby, where Luffy and the crew try to save Robin from these secret agents. And if we're keeping up with the idea that Luffy and Sabo are in frequent contact still, then I can see the revolutionaries taking advantage of the chaos on the government island here. Maybe they sneak in and steal some valuable information or something like that. So after the Straw Hats rescue Robin, we reach the first major change during Luffy's encounter with the former revolutionary Kuma on Thriller Bark. But first of all, since Luffy's already way stronger at this point, he'd probably have a very easy time defeating this shadow guy, which means that he will be awake for the epic confrontation at the end of this arc. Now, I won't get too heavy into manga spoilers here, but this scene hits quite a way harder with what we recently learned about Kuma now, and I cannot even imagine how much it would break Luffy to see that his friend Kuma has now been turned into a government slave. But of course, we also now have to ask if Kuma would ever follow through with his orders and actually try to kill Luffy, though to be fair, that's even questionable in the original story. Because you do have to remember that for the purposes of this video, Luffy did grow up with the revolutionaries and would definitely have known Kuma really well. And so the warlord here might just straight up refuse to kill his former friend, so it's entirely possible that we never get the nothing happened moment in this version of the story. And of course, on top of that, I can say that the most devastating moments in the entire story would also be very different here. Because Sabaody is the point in the story where the Straw Hats truly learn just how evil the Celestial Dragons are and exactly how outmatched they would be when facing the Admirals. And so considering that this time around Luffy actually knows about the World Nobles, he might go even further than just punching this guy and might just straight up kill this man, which is extreme, yeah, I know, but Revolutionary Luffy has seen a lot of stuff and is a quite different man. But that's just the first possible change here, because we also simply have to reevaluate what would happen at the end of this arc. Because before, Luffy and the crew just straight up did not trust Kuma at all, so when he came in making everyone disappear, there was major panic. But in this scenario right now, Luffy should be able to figure out pretty quickly that Kuma is just trying to help them. So instead of absolutely losing their minds as Kuma sends each member away, they might be a lot more willing to actually go along with what Kuma was doing here. However, that's just the start of the insanity, because now things are really going to heat up for Revolutionary Luffy, because at this point, I do think that Kuma would change where he sends Luffy, and instead of landing on Amazon Lily as he did in the original story, Luffy instead lands where he grew up, and that's of course at the Revolutionary Army base on the island of Baltigo. That's of course assuming that Kuma knows where the current base was in Baltigo, but let's just imagine that he does. So Luffy crash lands on his father's doorstep, which of course he probably would not like at all. But much more importantly, he will very soon learn about a major world event that is going to change everything. And that's of course because it is at this time that the news rapidly spread about Ace's capture and execution date. And even though in this version Luffy did not grow up with Ace, Sabo did for most of his childhood. And I do think that both of them would absolutely want to free Ace. Which does mean that the revolutionaries are going to suit up for battle. And while Dragon might say that a full-on assault on Impel Down is way too risky, I could see them joining the chaotic war at Marineford. So do get ready ready because Luffy and Sabo are about to crash this massive party. And while the thought of Dragon just straight up showing up and fighting at Marineford might be pretty awesome, I do think he might also take just advantage of the distraction to himself sneak into Impel Down himself and free his second in command Ivankov. But back to the war for now. Because with Luffy and Sabo here to fight, they quickly team up with the Whitebeard Allies and try to free Ace. And while I don't really think that the revolutionaries would send their entire army here, as long as they have a small enough squad of powerful fighters present, like the Revolutionary Army commanders, they should be able to make a major impact in this battle. In fact, when you think about it, Bello Betty, one of the commander's powers here, might just be perfect for an all-out war just like this, since she can encourage the allies to fight even harder and pump up their power with her Devil Fruit. Plus, on top of that, with our now super upgraded version of Luffy and an equally powerful Sabo, I really think that they are strong enough to free Ace and survive as well. And since we're already here, let's say that Luffy goes way over the top and once again declares war on the world government, but this time he says it as a revolutionary and even plants a revolutionary flag in front of the entire Marine forces at Marineford, which is going to change everything. Because yeah, that's right. I think at this point it would be time for Luffy to rejoin the Revolutionary Army, because with everything that Luffy has seen and experienced up to this point, I do think that it's very reasonable to think that he would fully commit to taking down the world nobles. Which yeah, would mean goodbye to the pirate adventure for now, but this Luffy would very likely care way more about freeing all the oppressed people in the world as soon as possible, so this change does make a lot of sense to me. Which of course also means that Luffy and Sabo will be permanently reunited, although I'm not really sure if Luffy would become the new second in command and bump Sabo down, or if they would just kind of be like co-second in command or something. But the important thing is that Luffy is back with the revolutionaries, which was the whole point of this video, of course. And that of course would mean that the Straw Hats would be joining up as well, and it's honestly kind of nuts to think how perfectly each of the Straw Hats' dreams still can be reached once they just stop being pirates and become revolutionaries instead. Nami, for instance, can just still travel around making her own maps, plus the revolutionaries probably even have their own secret stash of maps that she would just love to explore. There are also tons and tons of strong enemies to fight for Zoro to grow as a swordsman. Robin already has ties with the revolutionaries, and Chopper can still study medicine, and so on and so forth. As for Ace, I do think he'd probably want to stick with the Whitebeard pirates, especially if we assume that the former emperor still died during the battle. But even without Ace, the revolutionaries just got a massive power boost, because after some vigorous training for the Straw Hats to get stronger, we can easily say that Luffy is now one of the top 2 or 3 fighters in the entire organization. Zoro and Sanji are probably top 6 or 7, if not even higher, and the rest of the crew are huge additions to the overall strength of the entire army. And so with this insane jump in power, I could even see the revolutionaries step up their mission to take down the Celestial Dragons and free oppressed countries. In fact, the crew might very well still visit many of the same islands as they do in the original story. For example, Fishman Island was about to be taken over by this evil fishman, so they could use someone to save them. Dressrosa is still being oppressed by Doflamingo. Wano had literally become a wasteland under the Emperor Kaido, so I could really easily see Luffy and the revolutionaries still going to these places to free more countries and gain a lot more allies, even though Luffy wouldn't have direct ties with characters like Law and Momonosuke at this point. But let's be real, in the end, it would just be so fitting if Luffy still unlocks Gear 5 on Wano and his advanced Conqueror's Haki during the fight with Kaido, since he is a true symbol of freedom and liberation at this point. But of course, that also means that all of this is now leading up to the undeniable future clash with the Marines and the world government, and while we're still waiting to see how that would go, I can just imagine that with all of the allies of the revolutionaries, plus a now fully awakened Luffy and the crew, that they would be able to take down the world government and free down the world, maybe even more easily than in the actual story. However, that does actually leave another major problem, because fighting the Marines would put them directly against family and friends such as Garp and Luffy's old friend Kobe, who are both going to be incredibly powerful characters at this point. I mean, Kobe, for instance, went from this wimpy kid to being an absolute chat for some reason, and now that I'm thinking about it, I kind of wonder what might have happened if instead of Luffy training with his father, he actually followed his grandfather's wish to become a Marine. Right from the beginning of One Piece, we are being told that the Marines are the greatest enemies for pirates and a massive obstacle for Luffy becoming Pirate King. To put it simply, pirates want absolute freedom and change, while Marines want control and stability. And so Luffy's path to becoming a legendary pirate is full of battles with the Marine organization. However, during this mini arc about Luffy's childhood, it's actually explained to us that his grandfather, who raised him instead of his parents and who is one of the most powerful and famous Marines in the story, always wanted Luffy to follow in his footsteps. Now in the end, Luffy of course chose to follow in the footsteps of Shanks instead, quickly becoming a pirate and a prime target for the Marines. But that still leaves a very interesting question on the table. What if Luffy never got inspired by Shanks? What if instead of a pirate, Luffy had become a Marine? So our story starts during Luffy's childhood, where he originally got inspired to become a pirate in the first place. Of course, we could simply assume here that Luffy never meets Shanks in the first place. However, I think we still want Luffy to eat his devil fruit that Shanks brought with him. Instead, Luffy needs someone else to be inspired by before Shanks ever arrives on his islands. So for our specific scenario here, I want to assume that Luffy's grandfather Garp brings along one of his former students to visit Luffy, the Marine Admiral Aokiji. That's this guy here with the ice powers. In the actual storyline, Aokiji has always been sympathetic towards Luffy. He was relieved that Luffy took in Robin and allowed Luffy and the Straw Hats to escape multiple times. Basically, throughout the story, we are being told that Aokiji is basically the ideal Marine who has a fair sense of justice and truly cares about the safety and the happiness of the people. So Luffy, who badly needs a role model, sees him using his epic ice powers and beat up some bad guys, which I think would be a great alternative to Shanks. Now, saying goodbye to Luffy's grandfather Garp, Aokiji makes Luffy promise to one day become a great Marine as well. And so now Luffy's new goal is not to become Pirate King. Instead, he now wants to become the Marine Fleet Admiral. And with that, we have the decisive change in Luffy's story. And from here on out, the rest of his childhood can stay pretty much exactly the same, training with Garp, Sabo, and Ace. Shanks then still arrives at the island, Luffy still befriends his entire crew, and he still eats his devil fruit because he gets too hungry. But what happens next is where it gets really interesting. Before we can talk about what happens with the other Straw Hats and how the story overall plays out from here, I need to make two assumptions about the main storyline that are very likely to be true but haven't officially been confirmed yet. Assumption 1 is that Garp is a member of SWORD. In case you don't know, SWORD is a secret group within the Marines that doesn't like how the Marines are being controlled and used by the corrupt world government of the One Piece world, and instead want to create a much more just and good Marine Corps. And assumption 2 is that Shanks knows that Luffy is important to change the world, and that Shanks wants Luffy to become Pirate King and find the One Piece. In case you're already caught up to the manga and don't mind spoilers, I do have two videos discussing both of these claims in detail that you can watch later. This one and this one. But for us right now, it's only important to know that Shanks really tries to inspire Luffy to become Pirate King here, but fails. However, even though Luffy wants to become a Marine, thanks to Shanks, he still very much likes the idea of having a sort of crew or team around him. Now, skipping forward to 10 years later, Luffy sets out in his small boat in exactly the same way as he does in the main storyline. However, this time his goal is not to find a pirate crew, but instead find a Marine base where he can enlist into the Navy. Now, what's important to know here is that he's still Luffy and he still has no experience of sailing a boat, so once again he ends up in that barrel on Alvida's ship. Here he saves Kobe, and the two of them end up in the exact same town as before. This time not to actually look for Zoro and recruit him, but to join the Marines at the base in the town. However, when Luffy sees Zoro tied in the courtyard and talks to him, he starts to realize that the Marine captain and his son here are terrible people. And so Luffy being Luffy, I like to think that he still takes an interest in Zoro and decides to set him free, even if it will cost him his dream of becoming an admiral. And so after he beats up X and Morgan once again, he asked the Marines if he, Kobe, and Zoro could still join the Marines, even though of course he never discussed that with Zoro in the first place. Now, I think what would happen here is that even though the Marines of the base are actually really thankful to Luffy, like it happens in the main storyline, when more soldiers arrive from the Marine headquarters to arrest Morgan, he tells them about Luffy's attack on the base. And as a result, the captain of the squad who just arrived tells Luffy that even though he is really grateful for what he just did, he can't let someone join the Marines who attacked one of the higher-ups. When it looks like Luffy has to give up on his dream though, to everyone's surprise, Garp is also on board of the ship, however, who had come to pick up Luffy personally. And as we all know, Garp isn't someone that cares about the rules or the higher-ups at all, and he just decides to take all of them in as recruits. So now, Luffy, Zoro, Kobe, and Helmeppo are making their way towards the Grand Line and Marine headquarters on board of Garp's ship. There, of course, he trains them really hard every single day. Now, remember, Garp was able to teach people like Kobe and Helmeppo, who are really nobodies when he picks them up, a ton of super strong techniques in a matter of months. So just imagine how fast Luffy and Zoro would grow under his supervision. Next, since Luffy and Zoro are not in need for a better pirate ship this time though, they never make it to Syrup Village, where they meet Usopp in the main storyline. And as a result, Captain Kuro can execute his plan to plunder the village, and Usopp is being killed. Now, Sanji, however, is a completely different story, and I do have to go on a small tangent here. Usually, marine ships have a unique ability that pirate ships don't. While all pirates must enter the Grand Line by going through Reverse Mountain, marine ships can actually cross the so-called Calm Belt, which is a strip of ocean between the Grand Line and the normal ocean that has no wind and is filled with giant sea monsters that sink any ship that tries to pass through it. However, the bottom of marine ships are all coated in a special material called sea stone that basically makes them invisible to these monsters, so they can enter and leave the Grand Line when and wherever they please. And so Garp could take them directly through the Calm Belt to the Marine headquarters, but I do like to think that he would want to spend as much time with his new recruits as possible before showing them to the Fleet Admiral Sengoku and the other higher-ups, and also show his grandson the world a little bit. And so for our scenario here, I'm going to assume that Garp would take the ship towards Reverse Mountain instead. As a result, they once again would pass by the Baratier on their way to the Grand Line. Again, this could go either way because Luffy really needs to do some convincing to get Sanji to join his crew in the main storyline, but I do like to think that he would convince Sanji once again to see the world with him and look for the All Blue as a Marine this time. Meanwhile, Zoro would of course still get his epic duel with Dracul Mihawk, something the other Marines are against, but Garp allows anyways because he just wants to see what Zoro has to offer. Mihawk then takes an interest in this Marine grunt who is willing to sacrifice his life for his honor as a swordsman. Now after that, there's of course also a real chance that they never meet Nami and simply pass by Arlong Park. However, there are two possible reasons why Garp would take them there anyways. Maybe he just heard about the corrupt Marines in the area that Arlong had paid off to leave him alone. Definitely something that Garp would do, I think. Or maybe Garp knew Belmare, which is Nami's foster mother, who was a former Marine soldier that then found Nami as a baby and was later killed by Arlong. After all, both Garp and Belmare were from the East Blue, so he might have decided to visit her grave on the islands. And so in our scenario, Luffy, Kobe, Helmeppo, Zoro, and Sanji meet Nami and later find her crying in the city plaza. Once again, Luffy takes them to Arlong Park and beats Arlong, in memory of her mother Belmare, and in order to draw a map of the world, Nami also decides to join Garp's squad and help Luffy. After that, Luffy is then promoted from grunt straight to seaman first class for defeating a powerful pirate, which I think would be quite similar to his 30 million berry bounty that he gets in the main storyline. And the last stop before entering the Grand Line is Loketown, where the group meets Smoker, who immediately takes a liking to Luffy. Smoker already started to like and respect Luffy more and more in the actual story, despite hating pirates, so I think he would vibe really well with Marine Luffy right from the get-go. And while Zoro is looking for new swords to replace the ones that he lost against Mihawk, Luffy runs into his father Dragon, who is having a tense conversation with his grandfather. And then they finally enter the Grand Line through Reverse Mountain. Now, here they meet Crocus, who is a former member of Gold D. Rogers' crew, the first Pirate King. Crocus, just as in the main storyline, of course knows about Luffy from Shanks. In the main storyline, he then helps the Straw Hats by telling them about the final island on the Grand Line, Laugh Tale, and by giving them the log post, which is a necessary compass sort of thing to navigate from island to island. In our version, however, Crocus is not of too too much help. He greets Garp because they once fought together against the legendary Rocks pirate crew many years ago, and he then tells Garp that Luffy is special and should have become a pirate. As a result, Luffy doesn't even know about Laugh Tale yet here. Afterwards, the group of young marines also encounters Vivi. Now, Garp, who knows her father Cobra, the king of Alabasta, recognizes her as the country's princess. And so, under tears, Vivi tells them about Crocodile and what he has done to her country. Luffy then promises her to take her back home and help her. On the way there, they stop at Drum Island because Garp has heard rumors about Ace having been there. Worried for his foster grandson, who is chasing after Blackbeard, they ask in the village if anyone has seen him. Luffy is not able to free Drum Island from Wapol though, because he is an official ruler protected by the world government, but he does at least get to meet and recruit Chopper as well. Shortly after that, they then finally reach Alabasta, where they once again run into Smoker to together investigate what is going on with Crocodile. When they finally meet him and try to expose him, the Warlord laughs at Luffy and Vivi that they can't do anything, and Luffy prepares to fight him. However, Garp steps in to stop Luffy. The Warlords are part of the world government and can't be touched by Marines. Luffy will have to wait until Garp reports this to Sengoku and the other higher-ups. Now, as you can tell, Luffy at this point is probably starting to get really frustrated and angry at the Marine system for its unfairness at this point. Clearly, what is happening here is bad, and Luffy's just supposed to let it go? While traveling the country, Luffy quickly gets to meet Ace, and then his group runs into Nico Robin. Now, Garp has no other choice than arresting one of the most wanted people in the world. When Luffy asks him for an explanation, Garp simply tells him to be quiet. However, shortly after leaving Alabasta, they then run into Luffy's mentor and hero Aokiji, who is biking on the ocean. Just like in the main storyline, Aokiji came looking for Robin to make sure that she was okay. And he actually manages to convince Garp to not turn her in, but actually let her escape. Now this of course gives him even more plus points in Luffy's book than he already had, who then invites Robin to join the Marines. Garp and Aokiji yell at him that that's impossible. However, a short time later, Robin is instead picked up by the revolutionaries and Dragon, although no one knows who contacted them in the first place. Now, since they're on the Marine ship this time around, other than the main storyline, Luffy this time simply passes by Jaya, Water 7, and Thriller Bark. As a result, Frankie is at some point caught by ZP9, while Brook is stuck in the Florian Triangle for just a little bit longer. However, he gets his shadow back just a while later, either when Moria gets defeated at Marineford, or when he tries to attack Kaido in Wano once again and fails. Instead, Luffy's group manages to capture some high-profile pirates with high bounties, testing out their new skills. At this point in the story, Luffy is already able to use Haki and also use the techniques of the 6 powers. Now, before they finally reach Marineford and the headquarters, they stop at Sabaody Archipelago, where Garp wants to introduce Luffy and the others to a pirate called X-Drake. Now, Drake is one of the few officially known members of the secret sword organization, and even though Luffy and Co don't know about it quite yet, Garp is already planning to integrate all of them into Sword as well. On the island, Luffy also finds his way into the slave auction house and is absolutely appalled. Seeing the Celestial Dragons buy human beings as slaves reminds him of the Great Terminal and how the Celestial Dragons sunk Sabo's ship back then as well. And so just like in the main storyline, Luffy's about to punch the Celestial Dragon Charlos when Rayleigh makes his appearance. Using his Conqueror's Haki, he knocks out almost all the people in the auction hall and takes Luffy and the others to his bar. There, he introduces himself as Roger's right-hand man and tells Luffy that he's been waiting for him. He tries to convince Luffy to quit the Marines and allow him to train him. Now, Luffy has at this point experienced a number of really heavy setbacks to his confidence in the Marine organization, but at that moment where Luffy's actually considering joining the Rayleigh, Garp comes crashing in through the door door, and after a short and heated conversation with Raylegh, pulls Luffy back to his ship. With a quite tense atmosphere, finally they arrive at Marineford, where Luffy, Zoro, Sanji, Nami, Chopper, Kobe, and Helmeppo are all finally introduced to Sengoku, Kizaru, and Akainu. Now, Luffy does like Sengoku well enough and seems neutral toward Kizaru, but it's clear right from the start that he already has a strong disliking for Akainu for the way that he talks and acts about pirates. After that, the next few weeks, Garp and other officers train the group hard and send them on a number of small missions. Luffy is even promoted to one of the youngest captains in marine history for his incredible fighting abilities. However, then news arrived that his brother Ace has been captured by Blackbeard and handed over to the government to be executed. And Luffy of course completely snaps when he hears those news, and it takes Garp's and the rest of the squad's collective effort to stop Luffy marching straight to Impel Down by himself to break Ace out. Instead, Marineford starts to prepare for war against Whitebeard. Now, as a result of Luffy never coming to save Ace, the prison break from Impel Down never happens. Jinbei doesn't manage to escape from level 6 either, and most importantly though, without Luffy's great escape creating a lot of chaos, Blackbeard's attempt to recruit the level 6 pirates backfires spectacularly, and he and his crew are defeated by Magellan. Now, the war against Whitebeard itself happens quite similarly to the main timeline, only that Luffy refuses to fight at all. Now, there are a few different ways that this scenario could go, of course. One option is that Luffy just snaps and joins up with Whitebeard to try and free Ace anyways. We do know that Luffy would do anything for his brother, so it's not all that unlikely that he'd just throw his marine career aside to do the right thing. But for the sake of the story, let's say that Sengoku or someone else stops Luffy from doing anything when Ace is finally executed. Executed by Akainu, of course, for continuity's sake, which of course absolutely breaks Luffy. Now, Kobe and Shanks stop the war once again, but this time, Shanks actually walks up to Luffy and talks to him. He tells Luffy that he has the power to make the world a better place and tells him to meet Shanks in 2 years in the New Worlds. After the war, only slowly overcoming his pain from losing Ace, Luffy trains hard for 2 years, and finally, Garp invites all of his students to join Swords. Luffy then takes the opportunity to meet up with Shanks and joins his crew as an undercover agent, like Drake does with Kaido or Aokiji with Blackbeard in the main storyline. Shanks then trains Luffy even more, teaching him the truth about his devil fruit, the importance of finding the One Piece, and reaching Laugh Tale. And at this point, I would say that Luffy either fully goes back to just being a pirate and becoming Pirate King, or he stays as a part of Sword, reaches Laugh Tale, changes the world, and actually manages to become the Fleet Admiral of a marine organization that is free and independent of the world governments. Really, at this point, I think that Luffy's just such a special person that even as a marine, he would still be able to change the world. So maybe a much better question to ask would be,
in the very first chapter of One Piece, Shanks sacrifices his arm and gives the 7-year-old Luffy his straw hat. This is to inspire Luffy to become king of the pirates, and at the same time, Luffy begs Shanks to let him join the Red Hair Pirates. However, Shanks refuses so that Luffy can create his own crew 10 years later when he's 17, which kicks off the story that we know today. But this makes us wonder what would have happened if Shanks had actually let Luffy join his crew. What if instead of creating the Straw Hats, Luffy had become a Red Hair Pirates? Our story of course starts right at the beginning of One Piece when Luffy meets Shanks for the very first time. Luffy and Shanks are the exact same people as in the main storyline. The only thing that needs to change here is that Luffy actually gets to join the crew before the Red Hair Pirates leave his village. So we gotta ask ourselves, why doesn't Shanks allow Luffy to join in the first place? Well, he actually gives us not one, but 3 reasons. One, because Luffy can't swim, because he is too young, and because the pirate life would be too dangerous for him. And I hope you agree that none of these are probably the real reason. I mean, Shanks himself was found by the first Pirate King Goldie Roger as a baby, so Shanks was part of one of the most dangerous pirate crews when he was Luffy's age, and it doesn't look like he regretted even a single moment of it. And yes, it's true that Luffy can't swim, but the same goes for literally any other Devil Fruit user ever. And we even see that the rest of Shanks' crew is actually actually very much in favor of Luffy joining as well. So what is Shanks' real reason to leave Luffy behind? Well, one possibility is that Shanks literally can't take Luffy because he cannot swim. One really interesting fact about Shanks' crew is that not a single one of his members have eaten a devil fruit. So maybe Shanks knows a place that you can only swim to, and therefore he doesn't allow any non-swimmers to join his crew. Or maybe it's because Shanks wanted Luffy to grow and prove himself without the help of a Yonko. After all, if you've watched any of my past What If videos, you will know that I strongly believe that Shanks was planning for Luffy to become Pirate King right from the start of the story. So maybe Eiichiro Oda, the author of One Piece, simply did it because otherwise he wouldn't have been able to write the story the way he wanted to. Now I'm sure that we'll get an answer for this in the future, but for now let's assume that after Luffy eats his devil fruit, Shanks actually changes his mind. If Luffy's the one who will become Pirate King and change the world, he figures the safest way to get there is by training and protecting Luffy himself. And Luffy is of course extremely hyped about this. He is now officially the cabin boy of the Red Hair Pirates. And from here on out, the flow of the story starts to change quite dramatically. The incidents with the mountain bandits in the bar still happens, Luffy is still enraged about Shanks not fighting back, but Ben Beckman tells him that he will understand one day why Shanks did it, puts Luffy on his shoulders, and the Red Hair Pirates leave Luffy's island the very same day. And this means that Luffy is never kidnapped by the mountain bandits, and as a result, Shanks never loses his arm. Now, as you probably know, Shanks actually sacrificed his stronger arm that he used to hold his sword with. In the main storyline, before he let the Sea King bite it off to inspire Luffy, Shanks was actually able to fight on the same level as Dracul Mihawk, the world's strongest swordsman. So if Luffy would actually join Shanks' crew, Shanks actually keeps his legendary sword fighting abilities, which is a huge game changer. Now this may already seem like a pretty big change, but it is nothing compared to this next one. And so in this version of the story, Luffy only knows about Ace from his grandfather's stories, and he only learns about Sabo years later when running into the Revolutionary Army. As a result, the three of them never become brothers, which as you will see will make Marineford completely different, but Ace still joins the Whitebeard Pirates of course. Now since Shanks didn't save Luffy's life from the Sea King, Luffy doesn't get inspired to become Pirate King. His new dream instead is to become the strongest pirate in Shanks' crew and make his captain Pirate King instead. However, just how Whitebeard was secretly planning for Ace to find the One Piece and take over the Whitebeard Pirates in the end, Shanks is also planning to make Luffy Pirate King one day. After all, Luffy has still eaten his unique devil fruit and he still resembles Shanks' former captain Roger. So while the Red Hair Pirates are sailing away from Luffy's home island and having a welcome party for their newest member, Shanks suddenly becomes very serious. Purposefully sailed the ship into the Calm Belt, where the giant Sea Kings attack any ship that tries to cross through it. Now Luffy himself is shocked at the giant creature suddenly towering above the ship, but Shanks has been waiting for just this moment, right Gojo? Clouds suddenly appear in the sky as the man with the strongest conqueror's haki in the world knocks out all of the giant sea monsters with one single burst of haki. The planks of the ship itself creak under the pressure, but Shanks, who just like Rayleigh in the auction house on Sabaody, has perfect control over his powers, has excluded the 7-year-old Luffy from its effect. And of course, Luffy at that moment, as you can imagine, looks at Shanks like he is some sort of god. And this is exactly what Shanks has been hoping for. Just like in the main storyline, after sacrificing his arm, he makes Luffy promise to become a strong pirate and one day surpass him. And even in this storyline, I still think that he would give Luffy the straw hat that he had gotten from Roger as a kid as well. So instead of training with Ace and Sabo in the jungles of the island, Luffy now grows up on Shanks' ship. As you can imagine, he very quickly grows incredibly close to all of the main crew members who now raise him instead of the bandits. And of course, there are still a lot of similarities to our main timeline Luffy. He has a very similar dream that drives him to become stronger. He still has his straw hat. He still lives a life of freedom, training, eating, and sleeping under the stars. And he still has a strong sense of justice and wants to help people. However, the Red Hair Pirates aren't mountain bandits, and so a few years after joining the crew, Shanks becomes known as one of the 4 Emperors of the Sea. In other words, he now has one of the 4 strongest pirate crews in the world who are now all training Luffy. And so as you would expect, this changes how Luffy develops drastically compared compared to growing up with Ace and Sabo. Don't worry, Luffy is still able to run and goof around quite a lot. For example, I could totally see him having a great time with Monster, this monkey that is actually an officer on Shanks' crew. Shanks himself would of course teach Luffy all about Haki very early on in his life, soon realizing that Luffy also has the potential to use Conqueror's Haki, which of course surprises no one in the crew. Shanks also teaches Luffy how to fight with a sword, although just like in the actual story, I don't think Luffy would be great with swords. Instead, as you can probably tell from my thumbnail, I think it would be really cool if Luffy got inspired by Ben Beckman and Usopp's father Yasopp to start using a gun. As we know, Luffy himself isn't stupid, he just doesn't know much about the world because he was raised by mountain bandits and running around with his brothers all day in the jungle. On board of Shanks' ship, however, I think Luffy would still be his normal freedom-loving self, always hungry, but get a really good education about all types of things on top. This includes geography, the different races that exist, the balance of the powers between Marines, the Warlords, and the Emperors, and so on and so forth. Oda has revealed after all that Ben Beckman is the smartest person from the East Blue in the world. So it would be really interesting to see Luffy take on a slightly more serious and calculating side with his influence. And of course, maybe most importantly, his outfit would look significantly more badass than it does for most of the main storyline. Oh, and speaking of Yasopp, not only do I see him teaching Luffy how to use a gun and observation haki, but there is another thing that I could totally see happening. Other two what if videos I've made so far about what if Luffy was never born or what if Luffy became a Marine, a common theme is that Usopp always dies. After all, without Luffy and Zoro coming to fight the Kudo pirates, Usopp's village is simply overrun and the entire island is taken out. And so since people have been complaining in the comments a lot about killing of Usopp every time, I think we finally found a scenario to keep him alive. Because if Shanks allows Luffy to join, even though he's too young, well, why shouldn't Yasopp get his son as well? Not only do we know that he felt extremely guilty for leaving Usopp behind in the first place, but both Usopp and Luffy would have someone their own age in the crew. And I'm sure that Shanks would approve of this as well, considering he grew up with Buggy on Roger's ship too. And so in this version of the story, the Red Hair Pirates actually drop by Syrup Village to pick up Usopp, who also goes on to become a brave warrior of the sea and one of the most powerful fighters in the world, this time growing up without any daddy issues. Now, since there's no one with a devil fruit in Shanks' crew, you might think that Luffy's devil fruit powers might get neglected here. But when you really think about it, Luffy also had no one else with a devil fruit growing up either around him, and he still managed to develop his skills just fine. In fact, I would argue that Shanks and co not only have fought with enough powerful devil fruit users to teach Luffy the basics and help him develop different techniques, but on top of that, they also know the actual truth about his unique devil fruit. And so to unlock his true potential, they might tell him about the true power of his abilities, or at least guide him to the right decisions. So I would expect Luffy to awaken his devil fruit powers at a quite young age. Isn't that right, Gojo? After all, after becoming a Yonko, Shanks would spend most of his time in the New World, where he started to establish his own territory. And so Luffy would undoubtedly run into tons of skirmishes and other larger battles with other powerful pirate groups and marines all the time, giving him more and more chances to practice his abilities. This of course also includes encounters with the likes of Big Mom, Kaido, and Whitebeard, which would be cool because especially during the latter, he would befriend Ace as a rival since they are both from the same island and have the same grandfather. And then once he would actually awaken his devil fruit, Shanks for the first time would tell Luffy about Laugh Tale and being part of Roger's crew, igniting the spark in Luffy to go see the final island for himself. Which now brings us to the point where Luffy actually starts his adventure in the main storyline. What is going to happen to all of the other Straw Hats? Oh, but before we get into that, it's a new year, but luckily some of the best things in life do stay the same, like my partnership with my favorite snack box company, Boxu. Now, Boxu has not only been supporting this channel for almost an entire year now, but they've also kept sending me these delicious snack boxes every month to make sure that I fail with my fitness goals within pretty much the first month of 2023. Actually, originally they sent me their Shinshu New Year box, which I accidentally ate completely before recording, so they actually surprised me with their special Sakura in Kyoto box instead. That's right, cherry blossom season is around the corner, and Boxu has worked with family businesses all over Japan to deliver a box packed with limited edition Sakura themed snacks. I mean, look at all this fantastic stuff. I would probably sell my cat for more of these matcha cookies. Actually, let me try some of these Sakura cookies first. Alright, they're both absolutely delicious. And in case you don't know the drill yet, you can use my code OHARA15 for 15 bucks off your very first own Boxu Japanese snack box. Because at this point, Luffy has already become a real monster that is well known throughout the world, who has established himself as one of Shanks' core crew members. As you can imagine, without Luffy there to save them, many of the Straw Hats would be doomed and the East Blue Saga would become pretty damn dark. If you really wanted to, you could of course say that Luffy is strong enough at this point to just start his own pirate crew and still meets his original people, but way stronger this time. By the way, if you're interested in the video about what that would look like with a super powerful Gear 5 Luffy, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments. But I don't think that it would be the most natural thing for Luffy to do at this point right now. But at least we have saved Usopp, so that's something, right? Well, when Luffy joins Shanks' crew, he never gets to save Kobe from Alvida's ship. He also doesn't make it to the marine base, where Zoro is being starved to death. And as a result, the strongest swordsman in the world doesn't survive. Meanwhile, at the Baratie, Sanji stays there as a cook, but I believe that the Windsmoke family would still find out about him sooner or later and would still try to marry him off for their alliance with Big Mom. And as a result, Sanji would get assassinated at the wedding party with Pudding. Meanwhile, Arlong steals all of Nami's savings and then forces her to keep working as a cartographer for many more years. Now, moving on to the Grand Line, here it is a lot more likely that Luffy might actually encounter at least some of the Straw Hats. After all, the Yonko and their crews are all moving around the Grand Line all the time, and we also know that Shanks has been growing his crew quite a bit since he first met Luffy 10 years ago. So really, it would not be that hard for Luffy to convince him to let someone else join. Now, first of all, Luffy would definitely get to meet Crocus, who just like Shanks is a former member of the Raja Pirates. In the actual official timeline, Shanks actually told both Rayleigh and Crocus about Luffy, who were waiting for him at the entrance of the first and second half of the Grand Line respectively. Crocus telling Luffy about Laugh Tale and giving the crew the log pose, while Rayleigh helped Luffy train and get stronger for 2 full years. So in this version of the story, Shanks also introduces Luffy to Crocus directly, and Luffy gets to meet Laboom and promise him to come back. Chopper could really go either way. I mean, it's definitely possible that Shanks and co make a stop at Drum Island at some point and Luffy just picks him up, but at the same time, he might also just never go there and Chopper simply ends up living with Dr. Kureha under Walpole's terrible rule. Robin would either stay with Crocodile, who would most likely succeed in taking over Alabasta, or Luffy might run into her at some point and make her join as well. We actually don't know if Shanks has anyone in his crew right now that is capable of reading the poneglyphs, but in case there is not, Robin would be an incredibly valuable asset. NL is of course still going to the moon. Pretty much nothing changes here. Frankie stays on Water 7, but would probably be discovered by Lucci and ZP9 at some point during their undercover mission to get the plans of Pluton. And as usual, Brook sooner or later gets his shadow back when Moria is inevitably defeated at some point and Brook becomes a global superstar. Now, Luffy does of course meet Rayleigh on Sabaody Archipelago though. Just like with Crocus, Shanks introduces the person that Roger has been waiting for to his former vice captain. Now, Crocus decided to stay behind because he wanted to take care of Laboon. But with Rayleigh, I could absolutely see him joining the Red Hair Pirates to help with Luffy's training and to make sure that he ends up finding the One Piece in order to change the world. Which now brings us to the word Marineford, which does get really interesting in this specific scenario. Now, even though Luffy and Ace never became brothers, Ace still goes after Blackbeard. He still gets captured and the war between Whitebeard and the Marines is still bound to happen. Only that this time, while Luffy is definitely angry, he doesn't have the exact same motivation to actually go and save Ace. Instead, he accompanies Shanks next to Wano, who is trying to stop Kaido to get involved in the war as well, as he does in the main storyline. Now, this of course means that the prison break in Impel Down never happens, which would mean that Jinbei stays in prison, while Blackbeard and his crew are all defeated by Magellan when they try to invade the prison. But let's actually assume for a second that Blackbeard and his crewmates actually managed to go down all the way to level 6. Because in that case, Blackbeard would once again tell all the level 6 prisoners that the last person surviving in their cell could join his crew, which would mean that Jinbei would most likely end up joining Blackbeard's crew, even if it would be kind of against his will. Now, one big question is of course, how did Shanks manage to stop Kaido from joining the war in the first place? Who knows, maybe the two crews actually fought, but when Shanks and his men arrive at Marineford in the main storyline, they don't look like they've just fought a gigantic dragon. So instead, I think it's much more likely that Shanks actually just went and talked to Kaido. And so while the two Yonko would have a meeting on Onigashima, Luffy would surely run around and finally run into no one other than Yamato. Luffy then tells Yamato about Ace being captured and about his upcoming execution. And since Yamato is of course friends with Ace, she wants to come and save him. As a result, Luffy secretly frees Yamato from her shackles and smuggles her on board of Shanks' ship. Then they finally make it to Marineford, but just like in the main storyline, it is already too late. Ace has been killed and Blackbeard has gone in and stolen Whitebeard's devil fruit. Now, Shanks and his men are once again able to stop the war. This time, Luffy's actually part of the epic intro of the Red Hair Pirates. He transforms into his awakened form and stands between Aokiji and Marco. The Gorosei and many people who are watching the live broadcast of the war are shocked at Luffy's true appearance. Sengoku, after a quick moment of shock, announces to the world once again that Luffy is the son of Monkey D. Dragon, the world's most wanted man, and an officer of the Red Hair Pirates. Now, Luffy himself, meanwhile, is completely unfazed by all this. Instead, he has to stop Yamato from attacking Akainu, who is mocking Ace. And while Shanks is negotiating with Sengoku about taking Ace's and Whitebeard's bodies to bury them, Luffy rushes to his grandfather, who is heartbroken about Ace's death. Now, after the war, things could go in many different directions. I could either see Luffy actually leaving Shanks' crew to find his own path and crew, or Luffy stays with Shanks and soon overtakes Ben Beckman as the second strongest man in the crew and Shanks' right-hand man. In that case, Shanks would most likely start preparation to reach Laugh Tale soon and make Luffy Pirate King. Or a third alternative would be that Luffy passes on his Straw Hat to someone else, like Momonosuke for example, encouraging the next generation to find the One Piece and change the world. But if you want to go down a really crazy route, think about this.
Everyone was shocked when we found out that Luffy was actually the son of the world's most wanted man, Monkey D. Dragon. And then everyone was even more shocked when it was revealed that his brother Ace was actually the secret son of the Pirate King Goldie Roger. But could you imagine what crazy and wild events could have happened if it was actually Luffy who was the son of the Pirate King and Ace in turn had been Dragon's son? Well, lucky for you, today we're going to explore just that. And now, to start things off, of course, Monkey D. Luffy is going to need a serious name change. And that's of course because Luffy isn't the son of Monkey D. Dragon anymore, so say hello to the new main character of One Piece, Portgas D. Luffy. Oh yeah, Luffy now got that double D, don't think about that one too deeply. Anyways, since Luffy is now a Portgas, I think that Ace is actually going to become a Monkey D. Ace, son of the world's greatest criminal. After all, Oda clearly wanted these two to parallel each other in a lot of ways, and with this wild change, there's going to be some truly crazy differences in how Luffy and Ace view the world. But hey, don't worry, Sabo, you get to stay exactly the same at least. Regardless though, this parent swap also changes our timeline quite significantly. I mean, for starters, Luffy is now actually older than Ace, which for for the relationship basically means that he is now going to be influencing Ace's development, not the other way around. And here's the thing, an absolutely major part of Ace's story is that he's very resentful of the life and pressure put on him by being the son of the former pirate king. As a result, he's a bit of a rebel, he has quite a lot of temper to him and makes decisions basically purely out of spite. However, now because of our major change here, he's going to idolize Luffy and have a real curiosity of who his father actually is. But since he's quite a bit smarter than Luffy, I think he'll come to realize quite early from his grandfather Garp that Dragon is actually his father. But I feel like that's already enough about Ace for now at least, because this is the story of Portgas D. Luffy, future king of the pirates after all. Because as I just said, Luffy really didn't know about being Dragon's son for most of his life, but now I think that will absolutely change. This time, Luffy's gonna know about his dad well in advance, and that's all thanks to our dear friend Shanks here. And that's because I do think it's pretty fair to assume that Shanks was actually bringing the Nika Fruit originally to Ace, as Roger's will would live on through his son. And so what would happen if Shanks actually accomplished that goal? Basically, a young Luffy wouldn't have eaten the Gum Gum fruit by accident. Instead, I think Shanks would have fed him the Hito Hito no Mi model sun god Nika very much on purpose. And now because of this really impactful change, I do think that Shanks is going to end up sticking around a lot longer to train Luffy on how to use it, and let's be real, at least some of the basics of Haki while he's at it. And due to all this, Luffy is insanely strong in the early part of the story, way more so than at the same age in the original story. And as a result of that, Grandfather Garp isn't teaching him how to fight this time around, so the Red Hair Pirates are going to have to pick up the slack here. Which is also really cool because Luffy will this time around actually know about his dad. And because things unraveled the way it was supposed to be according to Shanks' plan at least, Luffy is going to really bond with Shanks over his memories of Roger. And oh, what a cute little family dynamic they have here. Okay. Slow your roll, I do hear you. Manu, if Luffy is the son of Roger, well, how is he going to be motivated to find the One Piece in the first place? Well, first off, thank you so much for asking, that was very polite of you. And secondly, don't worry, because it's actually that fact that gives him the perfect drive to be king. Because we all know that Luffy is a young man who dreams truly about freedom and liberation, which means he wouldn't simply want to be pirate king like his dad, he would want to go even beyond that. After all, in his own words from the actual story, being pirate king simply is being the most free, and he's not free if he just follows his dad's footsteps and stays in his shadow. So really stop and think about it. There literally isn't a better motivator than surpassing your own father. It's a standard shonen protagonist trail after all, as we've seen many times before. And alright, so now that we've got his younger life out of the way, we can finally go on to the meat and potatoes of the story that's happening here. And so Luffy is now finally going to set sail to be on his journey. After once again receiving his own father's straw hat from his mentor and big brother Shanks, Luffy is going to hit the seas of the East Blue. However, this time, Luffy has a basic understanding of the 3 types of Haki, as well as a way better grasp of his stretchy powers after training with the Red Hair Pirates. But of course, that's not all. Now, here's something that's really going to change, because the timing of the major events in the story are all going to be shifted. That's because Luffy leaves years earlier, so he won't come across the same cast of characters that we're actually used to, at least not right away. Instead, quite excitingly, I think he's actually going to meet a lot of new faces, such as this young man with a really silly looking mask. That's right, Masked Deuce. You know, Masked Deuce from the Ace novels? No? Okay, well fine. I guess all you really need to know is that these two are going to get stranded on an island with our favorite Robber Joy Boy, and after after some back and forth, Luffy will actually nickname him after his younger brother Ace. And I think his infectious positivity and friendship are really going to convince Deuce to actually become Luffy's first mate. Which means that with all taken care of, Deuce is officially the first member of the new founded Straw Hat Pirates. But not only is he the first Straw Hat, because since Luffy already has a Devil Fruit, Masked Deuce won't have to split the Flame Fruit with anyone, which means that he'll actually become the official wielder of it. And as you can imagine, this is going to add some quite serious firepower to the Straw Hat crew. And this also means that when these two finally manage to escape the island that they've been stranded on, they'll build a ship powered by both Deuce's flames and Luffy's rubber powers, which I think we can call the Going Flamey, maybe? And with a crew member and a dream now, the Straw Hat duo will set out to explore the East Blue. And to literally nobody's surprise, these two would get quite hungry along the way, so they decide to make their way over to a famous restaurant that Lucky Roo recommended to Luffy, the Baratier. And so after they eat and maybe cause a bit of a ruckus, Luffy and Deuce would meet a hot-headed and also quite hot-footed Sanji. And now, yeah, there might not be a major crisis to stop here like in the actual storyline, but I still think it's fairly safe to assume that Luffy wouldn't have to work all too hard to once again recruit Sanji as well this time around. After all, a great pirate like Zeph here would probably recognize just how important the actual son of the Pirate King would be for Sanji to find the All Blue. And I think it's safe to say that with a little bit of convincing, Sanji will officially become a Straw Hat once again, but this time without Zoro there to butt heads with, and also a captain that will teach him the basics of hockey. So this version of Sanji is going to be no joke, even though he is quite a lot younger. Anyways, the time has finally arrived. The Straw Hats are going to make their way into the Grand Line, and at Sabaody Archipelago, a place that Shanks mentioned to Luffy, they may actually meet a quite important ally here. I'm of course talking about the right hand of his father, Uncle Raylegh. Now, what probably stays pretty close to the actual storyline is that Luffy will most likely have a quite similar conversation with Raylegh about his dreams and why he's actually searching for the One Piece. Luffy getting really mad at Masked Deuce for even thinking about accepting Rayleigh's shortcut to Laugh Tale, of course, but in a crazy shift because of the, of course, increased marine presence, Luffy and Sanji are both into a bit of a tough bind here. With captain level marines hunting them down, the Straw Hats are actually kind of backed into a corner here. However, because of a couple pointers they were taught from Raylegh, these two powerhouses will actually manage to awaken their advanced armament hockey. As a result, they narrowly escape Sabaody and then make their way onto Fishman Islands. And as I'm sure you can tell by now, Luffy at this point is kind of ending up on a similar trajectory to Ace in the story, but don't worry, things are about to shift quite a bit. Because after learning about Whitebeard and Jinbei on Fishman Island, Luffy actually decides that his path to power is to become an Emperor of the Sea. And so then, in a true Luffy-like moment that would define the rest of his lifetime, Luffy would ask his right hand to light the flag of the Whitebeard pirates on fire. You might remember that Fishman Island was under the protection of Whitebeard, and Luffy has now officially declared war. This may seem a little bit out of character, but I do promise Luffy may have another motive for doing so as well. But we'll get to that in just a moment. For now, the Straw Hats are going to make it their goal to help Luffy fight the Empress, so they make their way over to the land of Wano first, thinking that Kaido might be their best bet. Now, unfortunately for them, when they arrive, the big dragon isn't actually home, but as we know, someone else very, very important is. The son of Kaido, Yamato. Now, of course, it's no surprise though that Deuce would probably have to knock some real sense into Sanji for being his classy, flirty self. However, after this love mess, Luffy's going to put himself up against Kozuki Oden. Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot to mention, Luffy probably would have no idea that Yamato isn't actually Oden, and from the stories, Luffy would only know that Oden was a warrior who rivaled his father, Whitebeard, and Kaido in his prime. And so basically, due to Yamato saying she is Oden and that communication error, Luffy would decide that defeating Yamato would basically prove his strength and he could rival the Yonko. And so as a result, these two titans begin to clash, and their match is going to not bode well for Luffy at first because he's kind of outclassed by Yamato in just about every sense. But very much like his match with Kaido, though, Yamato is going to serve as a helping hand for Luffy to develop his strength of his toolkit. So yeah, I do hear you loud and clear, and I do agree. At first glance, it does seem crazy to imagine Luffy going toe-to-toe with Yamato, but you do have to remember what crazy teachers he has had up until this point. And also that a young Ace also had a quite similar clash with Yamato once upon a time in the official storyline as well. And now, as a result, because of this duel leveling him up quite a lot, Luffy would have his first proper Conqueror's Haki clash as well, splitting the sky above Onigashima in a quite epic looking battle. And afterwards, you just know that once Yamato finds out about Luffy's goals and his heritage, Yamato will just have to join the crew. She won't take no for an answer, so it's time for Luffy to next recruit an incredibly powerful crew member to the Straw Hats. That's right, without Momonosuke to keep him around, Yamato ends up joining the Straw Hats. Which means that now another Conqueror's Haki user actually joins the crew, and because of that, Luffy's going to have more than enough time to develop his own Conqueror's Haki as well. I think it's pretty easy to imagine that Yamato and him would have pretty regular clashes, which will push Luffy to even greater heights than before. All of this, of course, in preparation for his challenge against Whitebeard. And with that, the stage has been set pretty nicely, I think. Luffy and his 3 commanders go to challenge Whitebeard directly, or at least that was the plan, until Jinbei stepped up to the plate and challenged Luffy first. You know, he would probably want to defend Whitebeard's honor and punish Luffy for burning his flag back at Fishman Islands. Though, as you might remember, I did mention that Luffy had quite a little bit of a sneaky idea when he was on Fishman Island, because now Luffy tells Jinbei that he will gladly fight him, but he's got a massive smile on his face as well. And that's due to his quite sneaky condition, which is that if Luffy should beat him before Whitebeard intervenes, Jinbei will have to become Luffy's helmsman. And let's be real, Jinbei at this point is probably a little bit frustrated and confused, but because he's full of pride at this point, he accepts the duel with this condition. After all, there is no way that he could lose to some wannabe Yonko. But now, after all the training and stuff that Luffy has gone through, I do think it's safe to say that even though it may be a somewhat close battle at this point, Luffy's training and bloodline sets him way above the rest. And once Jinbei learns of Luffy's dreams, motives, and well, the fact that he is Roger's son, suddenly Jinbei would gain a lot of respect for Luffy. And so, after being defeated and being led down the path of Joy Boy, Jinbei actually joins the Straw Hat Pirates quite a bit earlier than in the actual story. And honestly, by this point, Luffy has done pretty well for himself. I mean, he's got a Logia Fruit user, a Warlord of the Sea, and the son of another Yonko on his side, not to mention Sanji, who's, you know, doing his best at this point, I guess. But now, before they really have any time to plan their attack on Whitebeard, the old man decides to bring the fight to them instead. However, before Whitebeard could even make landfall, Luffy leaps at him while his 3 commanders pivot to handle Marco the Phoenix, Diamond Jozu, and Doma. And you just know that once Whitebeard sees Luffy's straw hat with that familiar big grin on his face, it's pretty safe to say that Whitebeard would get really fired up seeing his rival reborn. And now, after this climactic clash on the Moby Dick, the gap in their strength becomes quite clear. Even Luffy in his current state would be no match at all for the sheer powerhouse that is Whitebeard. And so it's at this moment, on the brink of death at the hands of the world's strongest man, that Luffy's heart would begin to pound really intensely, sinking to a rhythm unheard for centuries. His hair flickers white, the ship they are on begins to warp and wobble as its structure turns to a rubbery texture. Whitebeard would let out a mighty, piercing laugh as he would see what Roger described to him over the shared cup of sake many years ago. Joy Boy has returns. Luffy leaps back to life, his cartoony rubber banding body amazing everyone. Goofy, wacky, and fully liberated, his fight with Whitebeard finally truly begins. And so the now newly reborn Luffy battles Whitebeard with the same intensity that his father fought with many years ago, splitting the sky as he awakens to his true conqueror's haki and sun god form as well. But still, even that wouldn't be quite enough to deal with the true monstrosity and calamity that is Whitebeard. The Whitebeard pirates, with their truly overwhelming strength, would defeat the Straw Hats once and for all with a crushing fell swoop. However, as you might guess, this isn't where the story ends. It's quite the opposite actually. Luffy, upon waking up with his crew, would be captured and brought into the Whitebeard pirates. And now here is the crazy part. Whitebeard actually offers Luffy the chance to fight for the Straw Hats' freedom whenever he wants. He would just have to challenge and beat the old man himself. And you know what happens next? Without hesitation whatsoever, Luffy would immediately try and fight him once again, only to be knocked down by Marco. And it's in this moment that Luffy would realize that he was really lucky in his previous battle. And he has to get stronger, a lot stronger for his crew. Luffy is forced to train alongside the Whitebeard pirates and takes the time to really develop a relationship with everyone on his crew. Of course, during this time, he learns a lot more about his father and what it really takes to be a captain from Whitebeard himself. And of course, because of all their powerful new crewmates, this time period would prove incredibly valuable for the development of all the Straw Hat fighters, as they get some serious one-on-one action and training time with all of the Whitebeard commanders. As a result, Sanji, for instance, could awaken his Germa body by training with Jozu, Deuce would master his fire powers with Marco, and Yamato and Luffy would get to truly work on their whole rooster of skills with everyone else. And over the coming months, they would end up developing all types of haki and all of their awakenings. Which means that after a few years of trying, they would actually go on to finally actually defeat Whitebeard, liberating the Straw Hats from his quite kind and fatherly grip. Not to mention, while all of this is going on, Luffy has also heard rumblings that one of his crewmates has actually betrayed the Whitebeard pirates. Because that's right, the member of the 2nd Division, Blackbeard, has attacked Thatch. And watch out, Luffy, because Teach is coming for him next. And basically, with this crazy revelation, we are finally at the start of the original One Piece timeline. This time around with a crazy powerful Straw Hat crew in the Grand Line. However, now that Luffy has awakened to the powers of the Sun God, a lot of things are going to change quite dramatically going forward. That's because this time around, Luffy would make it part of his mission to find Blackbeard and avenge his friends. After all, if we know one thing about Luffy, is that if you mess with his crewmates, you better be ready to feel his wrath. And in addition to that, this powerhouse crew also takes on a more noble purpose as well, which is liberating the islands of the world from the tyranny of their rulers. And now here's the deal. Luffy would see it as a means of simply becoming the Pirate King, but the world would see it quite differently. For instance, the world government would also take a much stricter stance on making it a point of hunting Luffy down just due to seeing his Sun God powers on his bounty poster. Thank you for the added pressure, Morgans, I guess. Sheesh. I mean, regardless, because of this reveal, the Gorosei decide it's actually necessary to send Garp the hero to take out Luffy. But in the meantime, while all of that stuff is happening in the background, Luffy goes on to liberate a bunch of islands in his hunt for Blackbeard. This is of course because he's also searching for the road poneglyphs, something that he learned from Oden's journal, which would be necessary to find the final island, Laugh Tale. And so he decides to start in Alabasta. Oh, whoops, maybe I got ahead of myself here a little bit. This is all just very exciting. It's actually on the way to Alabasta that the Straw Hats would make a stop off at Little Garden. Here, they uncover the warriors Dory and Broggy fighting, and Luffy just gets so excited to see giants duking it out that he just has to hop in himself. Growing to a massive giant size himself to match them in his Nika state, he starts to battle with these two giant captains. And anyways, during that clash, Dory and Broggy would very quickly realize that Luffy is Joy Boy. So instead of continuing to fight, these two actually stop their battle, realizing that the dawn of a new era is actually drawing close. And so now with their clash finally ended, these two captains head back to reassemble the giant warrior pirates, in the process allying themselves with the Straw Hats as well. Also, Dory and Broggy make sure to mention a particular crew of people that recently passed through Little Garden. A young pirate in a cowboy hat named Ace and his crew. Oh, yeah, that's right. Ace would be on his journey at this point, and it seems like he and his crew have caused quite the mess in the East Blue and has made his way into the Grand Line at this point as well. Luffy is of course struck with pride and excitement knowing that he gets to see his little brother in Alabasta. And so with that little detour said and done, Luffy finally makes his way to the Desert Kingdom, where he very quickly dispatches of Sir Crocodile. But also because he starts in Alabasta, he still gets to meet Nico Robin, a piece of the puzzle he didn't know was important until he discovered the poneglyphs were impossible to read. Luckily for Luffy though, Robin is very eager to join the Straw Hats, knowing that their goals would line up very well for her to uncover the true history of the world. Not to mention, such a powerful crew is bound to keep her safe from the world governments. And then on Alabasta, finally, Luffy runs into Ace and is very impressed by the crew that his little brother has gathered as well. Oh yeah, and I guess I should probably tell you at this point that Ace picked up a fair bit of the people that we actually missed in the East Blue. The pirate hunter Zoro, navigator Nami, the brave warrior Usopp, and a little reindeer fellow named Chopper. But on top of that, he also got 3 new members: a small girl with pink hair, a teenage girl with a big hat and goggles, and an older fisherman warrior. Because that's right, in Loketown, Ace was this time visited by his father, Monkey D. Dragon, and it was then that Ace took a little bit of time to familiarize himself with the Revolutionary Army and even took a couple for his crew. Heck, Koala and the young daughter of a founding member of the Revolutionaries, Jewelry Bonnie, joined the Spade Pirates, both because they really liked Ace, but also to keep an eye on him for Dragon. And so with that really touching brotherly reunion finally finished, the crews would once again depart, but not until after Ace hears of Blackbeard's actions. And because of Blackbeard's little side hustle getting in the way of Luffy's journey, Ace actually decides that it may be of help for world peace for Luffy to keep liberating islands. Ace, after all, has learned of his father Dragon's motivations and definitely feels the same way. However, he does need someone to actually spark the revolution, and Ace thinks that Luffy may just be the perfect person to do that. So for that to happen, and to be on the Whitebeard Pirates' good side, I guess, Ace and the Spade Pirates set out to take care of Luffy's enemy, Marshal D. Teach, even though Luffy is really against it and tells Ace not to. And oh yeah, this is great, what could go wrong? So with a new crew member Robin added, the Straw Hats would then make their way up to the Sky Islands, where they'd fight the the lightning god Enel. And admittedly, I think most of the Straw Hat crew members could probably take Enel out in their current states. But what's a lot more interesting is that once the Skypians discovered that Luffy is the sun god that they worship as well, it's basically game over for Enel anyways. That's because Luffy rallies the Skypians to take back what is theirs and knocks out Enel with little to no effort whatsoever, having forged a true alliance with the Skypians and Shandorans in the process. And so now, after making their way back down to the surface, Luffy and the crew head over to Water 7 to get some repairs, where they run into the man who has been hunting them all this time, Garp the hero. And of course, at this point in this meeting, it's that Garp has to make a decision for himself. He can either ruin the safety of Water 7 in an attempt to clash with Luffy, or let him go so that he can just live on. But here's the thing, Garp did promise Luffy's father Roger that he would protect him. So with all of that racking around in his mind, Garp actually makes the call to let Luffy go, giving him a one-time pass as a final favor to his father. Which means that the real hunt begins now. And so now that the whole Garp Garp ordeal has been somewhat taken care of for now, and with the Going Flamey being fully repaired, the Straw Hats would head off to take down another Warlord of the Sea. This time it's of course the menacing Gecko Moria, and while on their way to Thriller Bark, they'd also come across Brook, just like in the main timeline, and he would end up joining the crew as the musician. However, very much unlike in the regular story, Nightmare Luffy sadly isn't necessary at all, and that's because this crazy powerful Straw Hat crew simply decimates Gecko Moria. Honestly, at this point, Yamato alone could probably just pull a Kaido and knock Moria down herself. Needless to say, there is no chance that Gecko Moria holds even a candle to a Yonko level Straw Hat crew in their state right now. But now, it's really important to actually remember that there is another warlord on the island as well, and he is the one who's about to make a complete 180. Yep, Bartholomew Kuma does his job of stepping up to Luffy, but wait, no, that can't be right. Is he really him? Oh my god, it is! Because you just know that Kuma would actually recognize those drums of liberation and that dance anywhere, because he now has finally found his sun god Nika. And after seeing his literal messiah, Kuma would weep tears of joy and honestly really confuse everyone around him in the process. And in this moment of confusion, Jinbei would take it upon himself to clear up all of the dastardly rumors that he has heard about Kuma. Also informing Kuma that his daughter Bonnie is actually safe with Luffy's brother in the process as well. And now with all of that said, Kuma would be broken by this level of happiness, begging to join the Straw Hats on their crusade, hoping to finally see Bonnie again soon. And of course, how could Luffy possibly deny another incredibly kind-hearted and very powerful Straw Hat member anyways? And so with that absolutely, let's be real, insanely powerful addition, Luffy's crew may truly be that of the Pirate King already, because I'm starting to think that there is actually no pirate who could actually stop him at this point. Unfortunately for him though, his next foes may no longer be pirates. Because you see, while all of this was happening on Thriller Bark, Luffy has received a message from the Spade Pirates, because it turns out that Ace, like in the real story, has clashed with Blackbeard and has been taken hostage. The crew is stranded and overheard Blackbeard's plan to get Ace executed for being the son of Dragon. And here we go again. This isn't looking great, is it? Which means that as fast as they possibly can, the Straw Hats now make their way over to the Banaro Island and retrieve the Spade Pirates. And once they do, they come to the collective conclusion that the best decision will be to lay siege to Marineford instead of trying to go to Impel Down and free Ace right away. And now, while all of that planning is actually going on, a far more somber moment also occurs, because that's right, Kuma and Bonnie are finally reunited. Bonnie cured of her disease, this beautiful found family has been reconnected at last. It's an honestly heartwarming moment that's really bringing tears to my eyes, and that I still hope we will get to see in the actual story as well. But with all of the plans wrapped and set, the raid on Marineford is happening. Several calls and plans were being made in the time leading up to the siege, and let's just say, if you thought that the original war at Marineford was a lot, just wait, because this one puts everything to shame. And so without further ado, let's quickly shift over to the actual battlefield. Seated below Ace once again on the executioner's platforms like normal are the 3 Marine Admirals. However, Garp is nowhere to be seen. That's right, because due to his family conflicts, this time Garp isn't even allowed to be at Marineford, at least not initially. Instead, in his place are the remaining Warlords and 5 incredibly powerful figures who haven't stepped foot on the surface in what seems like forever. That's because the 5 Elder Stars have actually stepped into the fray, expecting the Sun God to make his arrival. Which seems incredibly powerful, but Luffy also brings with him not only the Straw Hats, but a true army to rival all armies. Because the Straw Hats have made a few phone calls, and let's just say the groups arriving are nothing short of insane. That's because arriving alongside Luffy and the Straw Hats are the Spade Pirates, who of course have come to save their captain, and the Whitebeard Pirates, because when his son asks for help, Whitebeard will heed the call. Plus, you know, he gets to see his old pal Sengoku, I guess. On top of that though, are all of the various alliances that Luffy has made so far liberating various kingdoms. Alabasta, Alabasta, the giant warrior pirates, and the Skypians all make their way as well to Marineford to assist their sun god in his massive battle. But wait, is that? No way. The revolutionaries? Well, yeah, I mean, if you think about it, of course. Given our father switch, Dragon is known to protect his son, so of course, if Ace is being kidnapped and the Spade Pirates made their phone calls, Dragon would be in on this entire plan. In other words, this battle is for sure going to be a fight for the legends, but what could happen? Will Nika fight against the Five Elders? That would be nice to see. Would the Red Hair Pirates and the Beast Pirates come to assist Luffy and Yamato? Germa enter to retrieve Sanji? I mean, the possibilities are truly endless at this point. All I really know is that Imu might have their work cut out for them as well with a force like this raiding Marineford. And while this version of the Marineford Clash may be the most titanic battle in the entire series, the biggest and craziest change is of course Luffy having fully awakened his Devil Fruit at this point already. Who actually rules the One Piece world? Is it the legendary pirates like the Yonko who sail the seas? Or maybe the world government's marine fleet, a literal global army that defends the islands of the planet? Or maybe even godlike characters like Enel or Shirahoshi? Well, the truth is of course that none of these people even come close. And that's because of course the true rulers of the One Piece world are the Celestial Dragons, the world nobles who live on top of the Red Line in the Holy Land, Marijoa. And while for the longest time we thought that these bubble-headed weirdos are just evil people that are slobs, some of them are the most powerful fighters in the entire story. The Gorosei, the Holy Knights, and Imu are just some of the absolute units among the Celestial Dragons. But what if there was one more? I'm talking about Monkey D. Luffy, or should I say Saint Monkey D. Luffy, because I'm about to tell you what absolutely world-breaking events would happen if Luffy was born as a Celestial Dragon. But maybe the most insane thing about this is that this might actually be the truth. I mean, we do know that at some point Luffy's father Dragon was a high-ranking member of the Marines, something that's finally been confirmed in chapter 1097. And we also know that high-ranking members of the world government, like the admirals or vice admirals like Garp, are very much allowed to be inside the Holy Land, interacting with characters like the Celestial Dragons and the Gorosei on various numbers of occasions. And based on Akainu's immense anger towards Dragon, the fact that he's the most wanted man in the world, and Garp's immense power and status, I think it's pretty safe to say that Dragon could have very much been a vice admiral or even an admiral at some point in the story, and so as a result very possibly could have met a love interest up on the Red Line as well. And it may sound crazy since he's so much against the world nobles at this point in the story, but we do know that not all Celestial Dragons are for a fact evil. Characters like Don Quixote Homing or Rocinante are some really great examples of this. And so with all of that considered, if Dragon did end up falling in love and have a child with a world noble, it could also explain why Luffy had to be raised by Garp in the East Blue. That's because he could have very much known that once he turned on the government and the Marines, they would either come and hunt Luffy down for being only half of a Celestial Dragon and get revenge on Dragon himself, or keep and use Luffy as a weapon for their own evil plans. After all, he is the grandchild of the original strongest Marine and would be the son of an absolute force of nature, the most wanted man in the world, so hiding Luffy somewhere in the jungles of the East Blue would be Dragon's safest bet to keep Luffy and also himself safe. And while this could very much be what actually happened in the actual story, for this video we're just gonna assume that that's what happened and go with the idea that instead of betraying the government, Dragon instead decided to stick things out with his wife and raise his son in the Holy Land, you know, kind of trying to fix the government from within. Oh, I guess I should actually now call him by his new official Marine Admiral title, the Emerald Dragon, Monkey D. Dragon. dragon. After all, many important marines have animal and color titles like Akainu, the red dog, and Kizaru, the yellow monkey. You get the idea. And obviously, Luffy now being a world noble, his training and childhood are going to be wildly different growing up in the Holy Land on top of the Red Line. He'd have training from true top marines like his father and grandfather, but also some lessons, I assume, from the Holy Knights, which is a group of characters I'll be touching on a lot more a little bit later. But for now, with all the basics covered, we can really get into all of the world-shifting changes for Luffy and the entire One Piece world in this scenario, because as you can imagine, Luffy not sailing the seas totally flips major plot points in the story. Like, for example, very importantly, Luffy of course loses his signature powers. Yeah, that's right, since Luffy isn't in the East Blue with Shanks, not only will he never get his straw hat, but he'll also lose his only chance at becoming the Warrior of Liberation, Nika, which then leaves room for another young man in the East Blue to take up that title instead, Portgas D. Ace. After all, despite Dragon's drastic choice to stay behind, nothing drastically changes to stop Garp protecting Ace for Roger, and thanks to an awesome theory with very solid evidence, there is a lot of reason to believe that Shanks was actually bringing the Nika Fruit to the East Blue for Ace, something I've been advocating for years now. In fact, in chapter 968, we do learn that Roger himself intended for his own son, who wasn't even born yet, to become Joy Boy. And Shanks really had no reason to be going to the East Blue right after stealing this legendary devil fruit from the clutches of the Navy, except for seeing a young Ace, the son of his former captain, possibly. But regardless of that, this is how the story would unfold in our scenario, which means that now we do have Joy Boy Ace roaming the seas and a hockey beast on top of the Red Line with Luffy, because you just know that having legendary fighters like Garp and Dragon training him, Luffy would be mastering the basics of hockey very early on, even as a kid. And actually now it also does open up some room for something else really interesting to change, because now that Luffy doesn't have a devil fruit, well, he could definitely get a different one. And while we do know that the Celestial Dragons seem to shame those with devil fruits, we also found out in the God Valley flashback that they use rare ones as incredible prizes for amongst their own ranks. Such was the case, for example, with the Pawpaw fruit that later was eaten by Kuma, or Kaido's Azure Dragon fruit, which also got stolen from the Celestial Dragons. And with all of that known, it really begs the question if Luffy would also get a hold of an incredibly powerful fruit that is being hidden away and hoarded by the Celestial Dragons in Marijua. And I do think that the most important thing that would really determine that would be who ends up being his role model instead of Shanks. After all, Luffy's whole devil fruit origin story basically entirely revolves around impressing Shanks. So who exactly would Luffy be trying to impress up in Marijua, and why would a devil fruit help him to do so? I do think the answer is pretty clear. There is one incredibly powerful group among the Celestial Dragons that would of course be the absolute perfect role models and teachers for our young Saint Luffy, the Holy Knights. Okay, let's talk about them. These incredible figures were introduced only in chapter 1054 and act as the elite forces of the Holy Land. And as it happens, the absolutely craziest connection here is that the Holy Knights do actually have a quite deep link to Luffy's original mentor, Shanks, because the supreme leader of the Holy Knights, their commander, is one Saint Figurland Garling, a character we were introduced to in chapter 1086. Why is that important? Well, thanks to Film Red, we actually discovered that Shanks himself is also a Figurland, which will lead to some crazy results down the road. For now though, having a powerful warrior like Garling right in front of Luffy would really inspire him to join the Holy Knights, very much like Shanks and the Red Hair Pirates did in the regular timeline for him to become a pirate. Which ironically enough would probably once again drive his family nuts, because Garp and Dragon would 100% now want him to become a Marine once again. So really, no matter what scenario, it just seems like this kid will not join the Marines, except this one, but that's okay, because trying to impress the supreme leader Garling, Luffy would end up making one of the most most reckless choices possible. That's because he decides the best way to win over Garling to become his mentor, proving that he would be a great warrior of the Holy Land, would be by stealing one of their most secret prized possessions, one of the rare and mythical devil fruits. Again, we do know that the world government and the Holy Land both do keep some of the most impressive fruits locked safely away, so sneaking around either Marineford or Marie-Joie, Luffy would definitely find himself in a somewhat oddly familiar situation. He would hear a faint voice whispering and calling to him, drawing him slowly but surely closer and closer to a locked, ancient-looking box, sealed shut with the world government's ancient emblem. And after trying to break it open for many hours, finally he'd find inside a fruit that had been calling out to him. In this moment, Luffy would realize that he has the voice of all things, and it guided him to the mythical zone devil fruit, the Hito Hito no Mi model Susa no Mikoto. Yeah, we're cooking here. He would take a bite of this bizarre looking fruit and suddenly burst with lightning and energy as a great storm gathered around the Holy Lands. Suddenly alarmed by this and realizing what might have happened, Figgle and Garling, Dragon, and the Holy Knight squad would rush to the room where this fruit was sealed, seeing a young Luffy uncontrollably laughing and zapping things with his newly awakened Storm God powers. You heard me. I said Storm God, as in Susanoo, the legendary god from Japanese mythology. For those of you who don't know, Susanoo is the younger brother of Amaterasu, who is the goddess of the sun and is often depicted as a wild and rowdy god governing over the sea and the storms. How does that make sense? Well, after all, in the regular timeline, Luffy did become the sun god, and we do know from Skypiea that technically there are apparently 4 gods in the One Piece world: the sun god, earth god, forest god, and most importantly for us now, the rain god. And so since the Nika Fruit is connected to being the sun god, I think it's pretty safe to assume that the other gods of the past were also devil fruit users, or at least their powers inspired the devil fruits that are modeled after them. You know, like possibly Greenbolt's Forest Logia fruit, and now Luffy's Storm God fruit, plus the fact that Susanoo is the younger brother of the sun god is a really nice little call out to Luffy's original place as Ace's younger brother, since Ace is the new sun god in this timeline, may I remind you. And also it's just very on brand for Luffy to get the Storm God fruit, as his father, the Emerald Dragon, clearly also uses some sort of storm related abilities with either his immense haki or just a Storm Logia devil fruit. But most importantly, thanks to this rare devil fruit, the Gorosei are actually forced to take action and now figure out what to do with Luffy. That's because he's now of course an incredibly valuable weapon for them to use, something that the secret ruler of the world, Imu, of course would also notice. And so shortly after hearing whispers of Shanks managing to steal the Sun God fruit and giving it to Roger's son, Imu decides to let the Rain God block out the sun. That's right, the plan now is to set Luffy up to defeat Ace at some point, which is going to lead to a truly godlike battle, get my drift? But to really get Luffy up to speed here, the smartest course of action is to have Luffy join the Holy Knights and have the great swordsman Garling be his mentor. Now we do know Garling isn't exactly the most gentle person or kind-hearted person, and as part of this intense training, Luffy's going to become a true master of not only his haki, but also swordsmanship. That's of course because, as we learned quite early on, the rubber fruit's weakness is swords. Kaido theorized that would also be the case for Gear 5th, which is why he used air slashes against Luffy in their battle, something that was kind of confirmed in chapter 1093 when Kizaru forms a laser sword to cut Luffy and leaves a quite bloody mark. And Imu, clearly having some sort of history with Joy Boy, leads me to think that Imu knows this as well and would want Luffy, the rain god of the Holy Land, to be a master swordsman able to cut down the rubbery Joy Boy Ace. Well, which then of course means that Luffy's going to need a sword to match that quite divine title, so how about a couple of supreme blades named after the legendary Susanoo's actual swords? Yeah, Ohara from mythology. You might actually have heard of these. One is the Kusanagi and the other is the Orochi no Aramasa, the blade that he used to defeat the 8-headed serpent Orochi, who of course the Shogun of Wano is also based on. So, to summarize things a little, we've got a storm god Luffy that's become a holy knight and is training to slay Ace, Garp's other grandchild. The story is just getting absolutely nuts at this point, but what's even crazier is what happens when Luffy finally finds out that there are actually fallen world nobles amongst the warlords of the sea. You see, Doflamingo's story plays out very similarly as it does in the main storyline. However, this time the revolutionaries, who are now led by Ivankov, are forced to take the charge, liberating Dressrosa instead. And so when word finally makes it to Merijoa that a warlord is out there causing trouble in a world government kingdom who was a former celestial dragon, leading to a revolutionary presence as well, Luffy's role as a holy knight finally kicks into action for the very first time. Luffy's sent out by Garling to issue some divine punishment on the fallen angel Doflamingo, and in the process also show the world his overwhelming power as well. After all, in a fight against the Master of Strengths, a dual-wielding swordsman with the power of a literal storm god would probably shred Doflamingo into tiny pieces. With blades of lightning, Luffy would easily fly along the wind, slicing Dofi down, and even with the overwhelming power of the birdcage, Storm God Luffy would be a force that just could not be contained, especially by someone as weak as Doflamingo. I mean, let's be real, he could barely handle Gear 4th Luffy, and we're talking about a power that can rival Gear 5th. So go figure. And with the trash now taken out, Luffy would finally have a moment to reflect a little bit on things, because he's finally left the Holy Land for the very first time to see the real world, and Luffy wouldn't simply be satisfied, right? I mean, he'd be eager to fix the broken world he sees himself. After all, even in his slightly more evil setting, Luffy's still Luffy. At heart, he's a good person trying to make things better, and well, this just would not cut it. And so suddenly, with this newfound purpose, Luffy would set out to make sure that none of the other kingdoms under world government's rule would be threatened as well. A decision that would then lead him to come face to face with the man he has been fated to destroy, Portgas D. Ace. You see, since Ace has been busy fulfilling his own purpose as Joy Boy, liberating kingdoms and people all around the world, by this point he's scoured the world to find his father's treasure, and with Shanks' help has nearly found the One Piece at this point. In doing so, similar to Luffy in the main story, Ace has been able to rally the support of many of the kingdoms that hold the poneglyphs, the map to the One Piece, something that Imu just cannot have happen. Which is exactly why Luffy, the Holy Knights, and the remaining warlords are now sent out to defeat his fleet once and for all. And in case that things wouldn't go well, the world government also sent along the Admirals Dragon, Akainu, and Kuzan, and Ace's secret guardian Garp to assist them as well. And really, I think this legendary battle could only take place in one location, the Kingdom of Alabasta. After all, it's the home of the Nefertari family, a group who have deep ties to both Joy Boy and the world government, with Lily and Imu having some ancient past, but it is also the place where we are first introduced to Luffy and Ace as brothers. In other words, it's only fitting that their final matchup would actually happen right here. The full might of the world government squares off against Joy Boy, Red Hair Shanks, and their allies, the Giants, the Skypians, and the Fishmen. In other words, this battle would be insane, even surpassing the legendary battle on God Valley. I mean, we could see matchups like Shanks versus Garling, the Admirals versus the Giants, and possibly even Dragon fighting the Revolutionary Army. I mean, if they knew what was at stake here, they would absolutely step up to assist the Sun God, especially if Kuma and Ginny are still commanders. However, all of those wild and twisted battles couldn't hold a candle to the climax of this war. The most important fight is literally a battle of the gods, Sun God Ace versus the Rain God's Luffy. Their clash literally shakes the the heavens as their conqueror's hakis erupts across the battlefield. Pirates and marines alike would fall to the overwhelming will of these two conquerors. The earth would wobble and shake as Ains bounces around, using his rubbery body to unleash blow after blow onto Luffy, grabbing Luffy's lightning out of the sky and throwing it back at him, very much like Luffy did in his clash with Kaido. But Luffy is also a god, and in response, Luffy would let his blades do the talking instead, raining slashes upon Ace as he flies around the battlefield at speeds rivaling that of Kizaru. And I think that this really is the key difference, because unlike everyone else so far in the story that we've seen attempting to take down his Nika transformation, Luffy in this case would actually be hard countering it. Using his swords, Ace would just not be able to hold his own, eventually leading to a moment where Luffy would raise his sword high in the air and go cut Ace down, much like his father Roger. However, it is in this faithful moment at the end of their fight that Luffy is shown the truth of the worlds. Right before cutting his long-lost brother down, he sees Ace's crew fighting their hearts out. He notices that all of the kingdoms Ace has saved are thriving because of his actions, and he's shown the true struggle and despair of the Marines as his own troops are miserable. Everything that Luffy has known up until this point to be true turns out to be actually a lie. And it's here that Luffy finally would put down his blades. He's not like his grandfather. He's not going to cut down someone who simply wanted to change the world. After all, it's the whole reason Luffy is fighting to begin with. So instead, he would extend his hand out to Ace and help him up, stopping their clash and accepting that he has to change and that the Sun God's real goal is something that he can actually get behind. Because in the end, this is still Luffy, even if he was raised in a completely different setting. And from here on out, the world would be flipped truly upside down. I mean, who knows how Garling or Shanks would react? Would Garp and Dragon finally switch sides, or would Emu use the Mother Flame to destroy Alabasta and the two gods for good? All I know is that the rain clouds have parted and the sun is now shining through, and a rainbow of hope is all that's left.